যদি সবাই ফিরে যায়, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা সবাই ফিরে যায়, যদি গহন পথে যাওয়ার কালে কেউ ফিরে না যায়, তবে পথের কাটা তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে, তবে একলা চলো রে। যদি আলো না ধরে, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা আলো না ধরে, যদি ঝড় বাদলে আধার রাতে দুয়ার দেয় ঘরে, তবে বজ্রানলে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে, তবে একলা চলো রে। একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো রে।
Hi guys, thank you for joining the live stream. So we are just back from discussing and listening to the Alex O'Connor versus Ben Shapiro debate on whether religion is good for society or not, and we had a fantastic conversation with the live stream. People agreeing with some aspects of Ben Shapiro, some aspects of Alex O'Connor, often rejecting both of their arguments on some things. So now we are going to check out this particular conversations, which is one of my all-time favorite conversations on anything on YouTube. It's not really a conversation, it's almost a sermon and a lecture from this guy called Jonathan B.I.B. Okay, so he is some sort of tech bro who later in life took up the study of philosophy and stumbled upon René Girard, and this is his YouTube channel where he does fantastic sort of courses and entire lecture series on different people, but his favorite is René Girard, and this is the playlist. Okay, René Girard's mimetic theory. I hope someday all of you all go through all of it, all the videos. We are going to today check out at least the first two. I'm thinking about doing the second one as well, but the first one is basically a gist of all the things he discusses in the entire series. So if we have time and enough people stay up, then we can maybe get to the second one. I'm going to try to listen to the second one as well, but definitely we're listening to at least this video called Introduction to Mimetic Theory. The second one is going to be the hidden origin of your desire, etc., but they are separate topics, so the gist, the introduction might be enough for today. So let's start then. Check out Unsolicited Advice. Do you mean some band called Unsolicited Advice? Navavimarsh is saying, I was listening to Bohurupi song in the break. Tu amar hoye ja. Aha, nice. Today I was in a meeting with some of the assistant directors of one very famous and big Bengali movie. I'll not say the name. We'll probably do the arrangement of a song for an upcoming web series being directed by them, as their personal project is not as a part of that other team they were in. Okay, let's start then. This will be very amazing. No, he's like this guy, philosophical. Acha, okay.
Lecture 1. Introduction to Mimetic Theory.
No philosopher has influenced my thinking more than René Girard. He showed me how I was caught up in meaningless status competitions, and how much I was driven by desires that weren't even my own. And I wasn't the only one. Too many of my peers were miserable pursuing things not because they actually wanted them, but because society told them to. And sometimes I look back and wonder how I ever functioned without Girard's ideas. I see how swept up I was in vain pursuits, pointless social games, and status signaling, which Girard exposed and rescued me from. And if there were ever a set of ideas that radically changed my life, these would be it. The journey of acquiring these ideas, however, was a long and painful struggle. Girard's writing is hard to understand. His theories seem antiquated and abstract, and his books jump from idea to idea without an apparent structure. And this is why the series exists. Over the next 7 lectures, we're going to cover the entirety of Girard's system in a structured and understandable way, while exploring the relevance of his ideas for the contemporary world. My name is David Perel, and I'm going to be moderating these lectures, which are made possible by the generous grant of Tyler Cowen's Emergent Ventures program. As your host, I'll be listening and learning here with you. And with that, I'd like to introduce our lecturer, Jonathan B.
Rishi, if I speed it up, the actual portions by Jonathan B might not be that much graspable, because English is not our first language after all, and the concepts are a bit dense, especially for someone who is not that comfortable with the English language.
Jonathan, I know you're busy. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. If you're going to do all the hard work of setting up and I can just ramble on philosophy, you can have me any time of the week.
Well, I'm glad you could be here. And before you introduce us to Girard, I'd like to introduce you to our audience. And I want to start with how we met. I was hosting a philosophy discussion group in New York City. And at the time, we were reading Augustine's City of God. And I remember you being on the other side of the room and you start sharing. And I was so impressed with the rigor and the intensity of your discussion. I was like, who is this guy? And so we became fast friends. I audited your philosophy class at Columbia. Now we both live in Austin, Texas, where we must have dinner together 2-3 nights a week. And in that time, I've been very impressed. And what stands out the most is just the discipline and the thoughtfulness that you bring to philosophy. And what I would like to do now is talk a little bit about how you got here today. So you were born in China, where you were raised between Beijing and later moved to Vancouver. And you spent most of your formative years training in Olympiad math. At 15, you won a Canadian gold medal in the Pascal mathematics competition. At 17,
He's basically an Asian version of Vivek. I mean, Asian in the way that Americans understand to be Asian, of course, but he's an Asian Vivek Ramaswamy.
17, you were an invitee to the Canadian Mathematical Olympiad. At 18, you were awarded a full ride scholarship at Columbia, where you studied computer science as one of the top 20 Eggleston scholars in a class of over 2,000 people.
Oh.
At 20, you finished your computer science degree, and that's when you were introduced to Girard. And because of Girard, you pursued a second degree in philosophy, where you focused on continental social philosophy and Buddhist theory. At 22, immediately after graduation, you started building a fintech startup with Joe Lonsdale, which you've been working on for the past year. Now, did I get that right?
Yeah, I think factually that is correct, although I don't know about the exact ages. I'm a bit worried that you've hyped me up a bit too much. Perhaps not unlike our equity markets, you set me up so high that there's only one direction that I can go from here, and that's down. Although in terms of what the question of whether you miss anything, I think you did miss quite a few important things to no fault of your own, because no one gives introductions this way, that are relevant to my engagement with Girard. And those are all the personal failures and the suffering that I've had along the way that really led me to Girard. I suspect this is probably a much broader point, that when you give an introduction to a Girardian, that you should highlight perhaps their failures just as much, if not more, than their successes, because it's often their failures that really drive them to Girard. I don't think Girardian insights are rewarded.
Oh, you have seen that. Good. Yes.
Shall we say, in the
Yes, I was trying not to use that word, Srijan. Holy shit.
a victory of a triumph, but you have to go out there and scavenge them from your fields of defeat. And so it wasn't out of a mindset of achievement or even a leisurely strolling into Girard out of theoretical curiosity that I was acquainted with him, but I crawled to him out of a desperate existential necessity.
So then how did you find your way to?
Guys, whenever I have heard this lecture series or anything by Jonathan B from his own channel, I have had a hunch that at least in this particular studio setup, there is probably a giant screen or some LED behind this anchor guy, and Jonathan is just reading out of those texts. Can someone really speak like this? Of course, Vivek does. Anything these people say, any sentence they utter out, seems to be like a well thought out, well fleshed out idea written down in a book.
Girard.
Yeah, well, like I mentioned, it's mostly personal suffering and strife. But maybe to be a bit more specific, like many other teenagers, certainly ambitious teenagers, I was struggling quite a bit in my first years at Columbia, not academically, not professionally, not socially, but in a deep personal and existential
Oh, yeah. I was suffering not in an academic way, not in a social way at all, but in a deep way.
sense. As a freshman at an elite college, if you'll excuse a funny metaphor, I think you kind of end up in a zoo with 2,000 other hyper-conscious, status-oriented, prestige-seeking teenagers. And the one word that I think which captures the existential problem of such a...
Well, Rishi, René Girard was not an activist. He was merely pointing those things out. He didn't say that don't do it, which is what a lot of people have also misunderstood and pointed out in the comments that, oh, you point out that people are, I guess, silly or somehow a bit inferior when they mimic people, but you are trying to signal things by doing a setup of this sort, by wearing these particular kinds of clothes, by speaking a certain way, his way of articulating things. So you are trying to signal. So the signal is more important in a theory of in a mimesis theory or mimetic theory. Okay, it's not exactly the meme of Richard Dawkins. So this is not exactly meme theory. Remember, so the point here is that you are doing everything to signal a certain thing about yourself. You're trying to point out what it says about you, but also when you are trying to let's say the idea that you wear makeup not for men but for women, but that's only in a situation where you are surrounded by women who will take that signal in a certain way, and of course acknowledge the fact that yes, oh my god, this woman does not put up makeup for men, they do it just for us. So you see, they are still keeping in mind the man in the end. Then that's according to René Girard, a negative phase of mimesis. So because it's still in the end dependent on the man.
The community well is hollowness. And now this wasn't true for everyone, but most of us weren't really doing things, I think, for their own sake, but out of what Girard would call mimesis, or natural capacity and tendency to imitate others. I mean, think about it like this. 2,000 of, allegedly, some of America's smartest and most independent kids all end up after college wanting to go into 4 fields: finance, tech, law, and then medicine. And during college, we were supporting political causes we didn't care about to fly the right colors. We hung out with the right people. We wanted to see dating the right person. And we worked our asses off hustling for prestigious internships that a lot of us actually secretly loathed. And I think what made this all so much more perverse was that we had to lie to ourselves to sustain these pursuits. That if we just squinted hard enough and intoxicated ourselves in the equally drunken rhetoric of our peers, that we could fool ourselves into thinking that this path of prestige is the right one for us to really be on. And what was so existentially depressing, if you will, about such a life was not the presence of wrong. You know, we weren't being tortured, we weren't starving, but it's the absence of right. That even the victories felt so hollow and meaningless, like getting a prestigious internship. That was a 1-day or 3-day buzz that went away as fast as it came. And I think these victories were so meaningless because they weren't out of our own genuine desires, but a product of mimesis, what we felt like we had to do out of some kind of social pressure. And what was the wake-up call for me was in my sophomore year, seeing where this path of mimesis was leading me down towards. I was talking with adults, some of them alumni, working in Manhattan, and these were the guys who had made it, right? They had the right postal code, they had the right job, they had a hot partner, but they were fundamentally plagued with the same type of existential problems. They were making money they didn't need to buy shit that they didn't want, to impress people they didn't particularly like. And in them, I saw the same despair and hollowness, but in some
Boishaliti, René Girard is a philosopher also from the world of literary criticism. Then he ended up becoming ended up getting considered a philosopher because of how in depth he was going in his literary criticisms. He passed away in 2007, and this guy Jonathan B is just a tech guy who just got interested in philosophy and then became an absolute René Girard fanboy.
sense, just even worse because it's developed a bit further out. And how can one not be hollow when you're living life in such a way where you're motivated not by a core, strong impetus of genuine desire, but this external shell of social expectation?
Yeah, I see this all over the place. I see the influence of mimetic theory in so many aspects of society. You see it with people who take out a loan to buy some fancy car and they don't have the money to do it.
Right.
You see it in the way that management consultants, you'll be talking to them and they'll talk about the director level title at the company as if that's the salvation that's going to make them happy forever. They get it now, they're no happier once they get that. But the worst kind of mimetic competition that I saw was in high school. And there was this weird thing where the parents would be really competitive.
How many of you all have seen the movie called Moneyball with Brad Pitt? Then Wolf of Wall Street. So having the hot partner thing is always a very strong marker of a certain kind of mimesis. And like in Moneyball, the recruiters for a particular baseball team were, while considering many things about a player, they were also looking at and considering and acknowledging whether a potential player that they are looking to hire in their team has a hot girlfriend or not, which sounds insane, but then when pushed by another person in the room, the coach says that it means that guy has confidence. So we are looking for confident players, obviously, so why not a guy with a hot girlfriend?
And conniving over where their children would go to schools, like a status competition among them. And they wanted their kids to go to Ivies, these prestigious schools. And the trophy at the end was those bumper stickers on the back of the Mercedes with the university logo. And
Rishi, how dare you say that? You mean you expect our babus to have critical thinking? How dare you? You are not a true Indian.
Saw how through mimesis that people had lost their own way and they weren't even aware of the nature of their own desire.
Oof.
And I think it's this lack of awareness that, if you don't have a proper understanding of these forces, makes it so easily for us, especially in today's modern society, to get caught up in these forces. And I think throughout college, I started gaining a more and more intimate awareness of the logic behind all of these phenomena that you experience. Not because I was above the fold. If anything, I was so aware of it because I was the most guilty, that I was the most mimetic of them all.
Yeah.
And what was so frightening to me was the realization as a sophomore that I could live my entire life like this, fundamentally not for myself. I knew I had to change before it was too late. And I knew that there was a point where it was going to be too late, where the ship was going to get too much speed, where, if you'll humor another metaphor, the dagger is too deep in the old king's heart. Fortunately, in the pits of my despair, I was introduced to the work of René Girard. And so Girard saved me. And I really do mean that in a very literal sense of the term, in the same way that Virgil saved Dante, by exposing to him the manifestations and the mechanisms behind human evil.
Well, Nietzsche saved me, and to a large degree, René Girard as well.
As well as guiding his purging of more milder forms of perversion. Now, Girard saved me by presenting to me a theory of human nature that explained the true origin of desire and its terrifying consequences if not directed properly. He gave me a more accurate map with which I myself could slowly unravel and untangle myself from the mimetic web. And with this lecture series, my hope is to be able to gift this map to you and our listeners as well.
So he was trying to get rid of the mimetic web, but then people point out that you are wearing shoes, the socks, the suit in a very particular, in a very peculiar, very specific kind of way. You are deliberately sitting in such a room, then you didn't really get rid of the mimetic way, did you?
Wow.
So, Jonathan, I got to ask you, is the power of Girard's ideas that they're going to stop making us be mimetic? Or do you still feel like you're still as prone to chasing prestige and envy as before?
Yeah, you're definitely right. It's definitely the latter. Girard's ideas do not work on us by magically making us stop being mimetic and social creatures.
Right.
In the same environment, I would say I'm just as susceptible to mimetic forces as I was before. But his theory does have practical personal benefits. And let me explain with an analogy. I think there was a military theorist by the name of John Boyd, and he said something, I'm going to have to paraphrase here. I don't know the exact quote, like, superior fighter pilots use their superior judgment to make sure they get into situations where they never have to use their superior skill.
Yes.
And the idea under that line is that what's perhaps more important than the ability to deal with bad situations is the foresight and judgment to fundamentally not get into those situations. And I think the same is true for what Girard has done for me. When I am, say, already deeply envious or deeply prideful, the battle's already lost. There's nothing that understanding Girard and mimetic theory rationally can do for me. Mimetic theory, however, gives me a framework to avoid situations which inspire debilitating envy, which ignites sort of unproductive pride. It tells us what type of person to avoid and who to have close. It teaches us how to construct a social environment that is relatively sober and how to identify ones that are prone to mimetic contagion. Mimetic theory does not give us the power to resist damaging instances of mimesis in the moment, but it does give us the foresight to avoid them altogether.
Could it be then conflated with the idea of viveka in Hindu philosophy? Viveka meaning discrimination. Isn't this kind of close, or it might just be that it's just kind of close and not exactly viveka?
So do you think Girard is worthy of engagement because of how therapeutic he is, how he can rescue us from suffering?
Yeah, I would say the answer is probably yes and no, but perhaps let me
No, Vaishali, mimesis can't be natural in that way because, for example, kittens, they are not signaling a particular thing. Their brains are not evolved or just intelligent and developed enough to signal a particular thing. They just need a particular thing just for their material desires in that very moment. That's the end all and be all of their desires. Our desire for a particular object goes through a certain model, that model being the signal of what it says about you if you desire that particular thing. Kittens are not like that. Having kittens is, of course, a definite signal.
answer that with an anecdote.
Yes, virtue signaling and all sorts of signaling is a part of mimesis.
One of Girard's collaborators was asked that similar question, that why he was a Girard.
Gravity, isliye. That is why after coming across René Girard's ideas, पूरा का पूरा एक sort of एक secret चाबी मिल गया. I think these have been the biggest keys, sudden stumbling upon of different treasures and then finding keys that unlock almost every question in society, which is caste for Hindu society, and Declan Quigley, Nicholas Dirk's way of understanding caste, which of course I understood better because of my reading of Nietzsche and René Girard's ideas on mimesis.
And he answered, because it's cheaper than psychoanalysis. Now, this is supposed to be humorous, and the literal and perhaps uninteresting interpretation is that you don't have to pay anyone to study Girard's ideas, but it can still have a therapeutic effect of solving your problems. But there's a much more interesting reading, I think, that cheaper here means economic, being able to explain much more phenomena with much less assumptions, and not just personal therapeutic phenomena, but social historical as well. Take the example of Freud in psychoanalysis, if you're familiar with that. He had this idea of the Oedipus complex, right? Where the son is rivalrous with the father, and the son desires the mother.
Rishabh, on the face of it, Vairagya does seem similar, but doesn't Vairagya end up always being renouncing things? That's the problem. The goal of applying René Girard's ideas would be that, therefore, you never really are able to achieve it, but let's say he will give this example himself, that Think of Mark Zuckerberg going to a billionaire interview wearing just a t-shirt, because he is in the negative phase of mimesis, where he's trying to show off that I don't even care about you guys enough to wear a suit here. But on the other hand, other people might be wearing a suit just because it's a billionaire's interview, or let's say a lunch meeting. Okay, so applying your idea of your question here, the ideal goal would be that people just stop caring about the situation and wear anything regardless. That can never really happen unless you are a complete renouncer or a sannyasi, right? Because if you really don't care about it at all, not in the Zuckerberg way, not in the suit wearing way, and you go in a 3/4 or a tank top, wife beater, or wear nothing, then you become the renouncer. So vairagya, since it necessarily leads to renouncing, whereas mimesis theory just helps you in understanding society, it's sort of a sociological tool. Therefore, they are probably talking about similar things, but are not exactly the same thing. They're not the same tool exactly.
That's a very heavy assumption that we all have this inbuilt desire to have sex with mom, and it can only explain one set of phenomena. Girard's mimetic theory takes the same example, but sees humans as naturally imitative and desire as contagious between people, including between father and son. And as a result, mimetic theory can explain not only the Oedipus complex, but a much broader set of psychological, social.
Srijan, to be fair, I also thought that the first time I saw this guy. Then I checked out his own channel. Okay, he's not that bad. He's sort of that college jock, stud chat guy who recently got into philosophy, but it's pretty good stuff. He's trying to understand it a lot. Vairagya would be the solution to mimetic behavior, but it also always leads to becoming a sannyasi. And I don't see a point in eliminating mimetic behavior to the point where you think nothing matters at all and you quit society.
Historical phenomenon where people desire similar things and then enter into rivalry. Hence, mimetic theory is cheaper than psychoanalysis, doing much more with much less. So I think Girard, to answer your question directly now, is probably only so therapeutic because...
But is it really fair to say that vairagya necessarily leads to renunciation? I think it will inevitably lead to renunciation. I am alleging that it will inevitably lead to renunciation if vairagya is done properly. Am I correct?
He hits on fundamental truths of the human condition, truths which are overlooked, or perhaps even more provocatively, systematically hidden by modernity. And these truths help us not only understanding ourselves, but understanding the world and the trajectory of history.
Exactly what gravity is
I
saying.
think Girard's ideas help us navigate the world.
Exactly.
Help us see opportunity where others may see barren land and see danger.
Absolutely. And it gives you, now everyone likes to talk about critical thinking, right? But this idea of René Girard almost gives you a tool to understand society then and there. It increases your critical thinking by 100-folds then and there. And it also makes you a bit of a skeptic, and which is always healthy and required to build a nice society and create a nice government even. Sannyas will always be the prescription to vairagya. You will often notice Grihastha will also recommend vairagya without sacrificing the role of Grihastha. Yeah, he will recommend, but he will never be able to do it. Jitendriya is definitely stoicism, if not anything else. But I think if you do get victory over your indriyas, agar indriya jaya kar pa lete hain, then probably that will lead to vairagya and then renunciation. And if or doing the Jitendriya way, the unintended consequence will be that you won't be entrapped by mimetic theory or copying and stuff, or giving the signal.
Most people have already let their guard down. Let me give you a direct example here that I prepared for later on, but I think it's a very fitting.
Rishi, the problem here would be that a karma yogi might like the signal of coming across as a karma yogi.
Example here, and it'll go to show the unique predictive power of Girard's theory.
No, Vaishalidhi, when humans do the peacocking thing, that's mimetic, but for peacocks, it's not mimetic thing, because it's a very specific action to signal to their enemies. Now I'm using the word signal, but it's just a show of threat. It's not that much of an advanced, complex brain action. Therefore, it can't be called exactly mimetic.
Theory in the social world, beyond just personal therapy, because I don't want us to trivialize mimetic theory. The example I'm going to give is quite timely. It has to do with the relationship between China and America, the Sino-American
It will. Therefore, I'm skeptical about calling or equating this with Vairagya.
relationship. Against the crowd, Girard in 2007 anticipated the deterioration of the Sino-American relationship. And you have
Rishi, in that case, his signal will be that he is too busy and too cool for the signal. That's the negative phase of mimesis. You are negating the meme, but you're not. You have not moved on from it.
have to recall and remember how contrarian and unlikely such a prediction was in 2007. I mean, remember that in the 2000s and certainly in the 90s, a dominant view was that China's relationship with the West was only going to get better and better through economic liberalization. And I think such a view, which obviously seems hopelessly naive these days, was grounded on two flawed premises that were accepted. The first one was that China's rise would sort of lift the boats of the world economy and make most people in the West richer through cheaper goods and therefore much happier. People in the West would be happy with China's rise. And the second point, the second assumption that this optimistic view was grounded on, was that the increasing similarity between China and the West would lead to political harmony. The idea went something like, as Chinese people started watching Western movies, as they started idolizing American sports, as they wanted to send their kids to Ivy Leagues, that their values would be much closer aligned to that of the Americans. And
Yeah. Rishabh, therefore, I don't think we can overcome this cycle, but you can understand people and people around you. You can judge humanity and people around you better if you are aware of this kind of thinking.
and therefore much less conflictual. Now, Girard's mimetic understanding of human nature enabled him to see through the flaws of both assumptions. On the first point, we are not rational, utility-maximizing creatures, but social creatures prone to relativistic comparison. For Girard, America would be more unsettled, even if it were richer, but its gap between China had closed down. The absolute increase in goods matter little to humans compared to a change in relativistic social standing. And on the second point, Girard believes that it's similarity rather than difference that causes individuals and nations to enter into conflict. Desiring a similar set of objects would open up the two nations to a larger surface area of competition and therefore potential conflict and even violence. And so, at the peak of Sino-American optimism in 2007, and this was right before 2008, where the congeniality between the East and the West had never been greater, Girard stood against the crowd and warned us of such a conflict that will come from the very mechanism that most thought would establish peace, trade. Let me read you a quote directly from Girard. "A conflict between the United States and China will follow. Everything is in place, but it will not necessarily occur on the military level at first. Trade can transform very quickly into war."
Yeah, and Girard saw this in 2007 when America was busy producing US-China collaboration movies. All of a sudden, Jackie Chan is famous in USA. All of a sudden, there is Rush Hour 1, 2, 3. Meanwhile, then later on, when China has become pretty much an enemy, it's not really considered to be an enemy in mainstream society in America, because hating Chinese people is racist, hating Russians is not racist because Russians are mostly comprised of white people, etc. So then the Mission Impossible series, the newer ones come in, which are funded by China, Alibaba, etc., where Russia keeps on being the villain.
From this point of view, we can reasonably fear a major clash between China and the United States in coming decades. This looming conflict between the United States and China has nothing to do with a clash of civilizations. In fact, the dispute is between two forms of capitalism that are becoming more and more similar, end quote. Of course, 15 years later, Girard proves depressingly correct. We are in the midst of this very trade war, and relationships have deteriorated beyond what most could have possibly imagined in the 2000s. So I hope this is a satisfying, albeit somewhat startling answer to your question of why Girard is worth engaging. Not only does he help us understand and I think manage the part of ourselves most important but previously opaque to us, I think his theory also enables us to understand the world and human society in a different and often much more predictive light. But before we jump too far ahead, if it's okay with you, I'd like to give an overview on the structure of these lecture series as a whole.
Please do. Why don't you take the lead? And
They may or may not be, but therein lies the idea that Jonathan B was just pointing out, that people are in fact not profit maximizing rational human beings. Then anarcho-capitalism would have worked. That's what pisses off libertarians, that why can't USA be happy with the trade or even the trade deficit that's going on with China? Why are people so stupid and so pissed off with the situation? That is the low libertarian point of view. That is why libertarianism has been pretty much irrelevant, and even till this date, most libertarians piss everyone off and become irrelevant to absolutely everyone.
I'll jump in with questions and comments.
Great.
Rajoshi, I think the previous one already didn't get any copyright, and this one is also not getting any copyright because it's not what usually happens. I think Daily Wire has gone ahead and taken lease or bought the rights to all of those Jordan Peterson videos that we were discussing yesterday, and therefore I was getting copyrights. Daily Wire has that kind of a deal with Jordan Peterson, maybe.
I have two goals over the next 7 lectures, one theoretical and one practical. Theoretically, I aim to give you an encompassing overview of Girard's entire theory, from his psychology to his theology, from his theory on human evolution to predictions for apocalypse, from readings on Greek literature to his critique of modern institutions. I will present to you the entirety of Girard's system. Practically, I wish to show you how this theoretical system applies to your life in modern society through bountiful historical and contemporary examples. We're going to analyze, through a Girardian lens, of course, celebrity advertisement, romantic relationships, ritual sacrifice, the relationship between COVID and social unrest, the invention of coinage, social media, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the genesis of law, modern victimhood culture, the philosophical basis of innovation, and much, much more. My goal is not to leave you stranded with sterile intellectual concepts, but to give you a map with which you can identify the Girardian forces animating our world and your life in order to navigate its relatively choppy waters. Now, I've prepared these lectures for a public audience at an intermediate undergraduate difficulty. That is to say, it's not going to be a walk in the park, but no prerequisites are necessary to understand these lectures. Now, we are going to engage quite frequently with the Western philosophical canon, the Hegels and Plato's and Rousseau's of the world. We're also going to be engaged, perhaps even more frequently, with the world literary mythical canon, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Hindu hymn to Purusha, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Sophocles, Shakespeare. But rest assured, all of these, along with core Girardian concepts, will be properly contextualized and introduced. There's no prerequisites for these series of lectures other than interest. Now, specifically, the ordering of these lectures are as such. This lecture, Lecture 1, will give an overview of Girard's life and his work. It is a condensed summary of this entire lecture series for people who are short on time but still want to get a brief taste of Girard, if you will. And then moving on, for Lecture 2 and 3, we're going to discuss Girard's psychology. Girard focuses on, as you probably can already tell, the mimetic parts of human nature, our capacity and tendency towards imitation. Now, with this psychological grounding, in Lectures 4 to 7, we will dive into Girard's philosophy of history, which starts from the very beginning, man's evolution from ape, and goes to the very end, our imminent apocalypse. Girard thinks the world is literally going to end very, very soon. Now, given that we're going to be talking about such weighty concepts such as apocalypse, the literal end of the world, I wanted to throw out a quick disclaimer here so that I don't receive either undeserved credit or misdirected anger. All of the ideas I'm about to share with you are not mine, but the most charitable reconstruction to Girard. This is not me, but my interpretation of Girard. Now, I have many theological, methodological, psychological disagreements, strong points of contention with Girard. And I could do a whole lecture series just on my reasons for those disagreements, but this is not interpreting B, it's interpreting Girard.
Yeah.
I will present to you the most charitable interpretation of Girard I can muster, even if I privately disagree with them, some of them at least, because I've been taught in a philosophical pedagogical tradition that sees the lecturer, me, not as a door-to-door salesman of a single product, but as a wandering merchant with a whole caravan of goods. I shouldn't be in the business of knocking down your door and
Gravity, Rishi is calling him a yapper because unknowingly at this point Rishi is signaling his asceticism that ये सब सूट वूट क्या है, ऐसे ऐसे बोलने से क्या आता जाता है, वो यापर है, हम यापर नहीं है. That's Rishi's signal here.
shoving my single ideas down your throat, regardless of what your needs are. Instead, I should open up my little merchant caravan of ideas and try to argue the best I can for each idea in my inventory for why they are attractive, so that you, the listener, can have the agency to make that decision. But before I show you my Girardian wares, so to speak, let me give you a brief introduction about the man behind the theory. On December 25th, 1923, René Noel Théophile Girard was born as the second of 5 children to a Catholic learned mother and an anti-clerical archivist father in Avignon, France. Girard's father had served, he'd lost a brother, he'd been wounded himself in World War I, and passed his views on the meaninglessness of conflict onto Girard. And I think this view was further corroborated as Girard spent his formative adolescent years in France under Nazi occupation. Now, of course, as anyone in that place in that time period, the cruelty of the Nazis left an imprint on Girard. But so did the cruelty of the French resistance. You see, once they had been liberated by the Allies, the French resistance, now in control of France, started scapegoating and persecuting anyone who had tangential affiliations to the Nazis during the time of occupation. Often these victims were innocents. Many innocents, mostly women too vulnerable to defend themselves, were scapegoated by the French mob, blamed for Nazi collaboration. They were humiliated, dragged around on the street, and often killed without trial on groundless accusations. Let me read you the vivid scenes depicted by Girard's biographer. Some of them were young mothers with no means of support, motivated by hunger and need rather than by treason or even desire. Some were unmarried school teachers who were forced to meet with German soldiers in their homes. Others were restless teenage girls who just flirted with the foreign soldiers. One was a charwoman who cleaned the German military headquarters. There were no trials, only stylized rituals of retribution.
Right.
A shameful carnival that often included stripping these women to their underwear and loading them onto trucks to drive around the town. They were exhibited to the sound of drum rolls, shouting, and catcalls, as if the trucks were tumbrils in 1789, the French Revolution had come alive again. End quote.
So this is the France that René Girard is growing up in. And when, therefore, René Girard talks about ritual sacrifice and universalizes even that concept, I find that very helpful and fruitful.
These scenes of innocence being scapegoated will leave a lasting imprint on Girard and be a common thread throughout his work, both the meaninglessness, deceitfulness, and arbitrariness of conflict, and the perennial need of troubled human societies to find innocent victims to blame and murder for catharsis. Now, Girard's intellectual trajectory, on the other hand, could be described as anti-institutional and unorthodox through and through.
Yeah, and that's what will make you as well if you get into this philosophy too much.
He was always an outsider. He was an outsider from the very beginning. Unable to bear regular school, he had to go to a private tutoring program, reading at his heart's content and not to the dictates of any syllabus. He was trained in Indiana University in history, but his generative curiosity soon overflowed the boundaries of his diploma. He made little contributions to history and was self-taught and an outsider in all the major fields that he did actually contribute to. First, he made his mark in literary theory by articulating the idea of mimesis through close readings of literature. Next, he jumped disciplines into anthropology, where he shed light on the need for scapegoating. And then he jumped disciplines once more to theology, mounting a serious defense for Christianity.
No wonder his views are so well fleshed out, and because of this cross-discipline nature of things. ये cross-discipline से हमारे बाबुओं का और academics का बहुत ही गार्ड चलता है for some reason.
Now, despite being accepted into the prestigious French Academy and holding professorships at Johns Hopkins, Buffalo, and Stanford, Girard still remains, to some extent, an outsider in all of these disciplines. The literary theorists have beef with him for not respecting the methods and conventions and fashions of the day. The anthropologists distrust his liberal use of evidence and lack of fieldwork. And even parts of the Christian community have shunned him for his quite unorthodox reading of the crucifixion.
So the title of this lecture series is called Interpreting Girard, Exeget of Apocalypse.
In this very episode, he goes on to explain based on René Girard, that why exactly, I think he unknowingly insinuates why Christianity led to Marxism, communism, egalitarianism, and therefore victimhood culture. We will get to that, because according to René Girard, Christianity was the first religion that was created from the point of view of the scapegoat of the society. Every other religion has a scapegoat. Christianity was born from by being written from the perspective of the scapegoat of the society itself.
Why do you call him an exeget? Why not philosopher, or maybe something more provocative like
Rishi, not just the metaphorical scapegoating that's prevalent and again inevitable in every society, but you will understand the actual ritual scapegoating also, how that might have come about. That's the content of his book that I own. Where is it? The Sacred and the Evil, which we will, bits of it we have discussed in some live stream or the other, but we will discuss that someday fully from our live streams.
prophet?
Yeah.
स्केपगोट का संस्कृत है तो बलि है तो स्केपगोट है. सोसाइटी में अब स्केपगोट क्यों लगता है, उसका एक सोशियोलॉजिकल एक्सप्लेनेशन रेने जिरार्ड ने दिया है, जो कि यहाँ पे एक्सप्लेन किया जाएगा.
Well, that's a good question. We're not in the business of drama here, so I think I skipped prophet, but mostly I called him an exeget because that's what he called himself, and I wanted to have respect for his self-conception. You see, he explicitly in interviews rejected both terms, philosopher and prophet, and I think it'd just simply be too narrow to call him a literary theorist, an anthropologist, or a theologian.
Or therefore, my opinion is that yes, there is a place and almost need for Bali forever, and a need for scapegoating in society forever. It's an inevitability. But किसका बलि होगा, स्केपगोट कौन होगा, उसका हमको एक बार I think rethink कर लेना चाहिए अब. And therefore, a random goat might not be the best scapegoat.
Now, an exeget is someone who performs exegesis, the interpretation of scripture. And I think that is the most accurate way to understand Girard's system and the vast terrain that he is.
Yeah, in my vision of a Hindu state, a real Hindu Rajya or Hindu Rashtra, whatever you call it, Bali would be done of criminals who have gotten those life sentences. And especially if it's a minor, who has committed some insanely violent, physically violent crime, then there's no point in letting that minor go scot-free after he turns 18, because first of all, that guy is pretty much an insane guy, and there's no point now feeding him for free for 80-90 years in a prison. And of course, any other violent criminals who get life sentences. I'm against life sentencing by the way, but if there is at all life sentencing, there should be not a Bali of them. In the same way that religious terrorists of all religions must not be buried or cremated according to the religious rules of their religion, because their religion allegedly doesn't advocate violence, right? And any graduation ceremony would include janeus. That's the keeping Hindu society alive in a real way, not in a museum way.
He's forced to traverse. He's less a careful analytical philosopher, but a visionary expanding and articulating a moral insight.
No, Vad would be in the war, in the battleground itself. But Bali is in a more ceremonious, ritualistic situation. That is scapegoating.
Informed by scripture through all of these domains. I get a feeling that reading Girard, for him, these vast domains weren't these divergent disciplines, these separate buckets that he was dipping his toes into, but simply different manifestations of the same core insight. And I think Girard's aim wasn't to revolutionize literary criticism, anthropology, or theology, but to articulate.
I don't think so, Polymedes, which is why I'm against death sentences.
what he conceived to be the core insight of Christianity. Now that we have some context on Girard the man, let's move on to the meat and bones, the meat and potatoes of this lecture, which is a brief summary of Girard's system. I will attempt to give a reduced and simplistic...
No, Srijan, absolutely wrong. People have been violent in the more ancient eras. So, Bali Pratha would have always been there. Sanskritization के बाद उसका कुछ अलग ideas के साथ fusion हुआ, अलग justifications हुआ, और फिर सात्विक भाव के लोगों के लिए बलि प्रथा करना नहीं है या फिर गोट का बलि नहीं देना है, ये सब explanation भी आ गया.
Summary of this entire lecture series, which covers the entirety of mimetic theory, sharing with you Girard's key concepts and conclusions, but probably not the full reasons and repercussions behind these conclusions. Here I will trade precision for breadth. Now, for people who don't have the time for the full 10+ hour lecture series, first, shame on you. But secondly, this could be a summary that should be sufficient for you to get a taste of Girard. Now, for those who are embarking on the full journey with us, I think this summary can be a map for the expansive, tumultuous, and dizzying terrain
M. Shastri, that is the exact argument of René Girard as well.
Ahead, for you to gain your sea legs and gain an orientation of the landscape. The best way for me to give you a taste of Girard's system in one telling is to give a comprehensive history of humanity, beginning from man's evolution from ape, all the way to apocalypse. I'll start by summarizing Girard's psychology, how he thought humans were psychologically different from animals. Then I will articulate the problems this unique psychology created for early human societies and their respective solutions.
But is she only in the religious sense, but not in the broader sense?
And after that, I will detail how Christianity represents a meaningful rupture.
So what I'm saying is that scapegoating is a Sanatan principle, but scapegoating of goats as an offering to God, that's not necessarily Sanatan, not according to me.
For Girard from these early societies. And lastly, I will articulate how Christianity brought us all the way here to modernity and how it will imminently deliver us to violent apocalypse. So let us begin with psychology. Girard's apocalyptic conclusions begin with a rather innocuous observation, mimesis. What defined for Girard our evolutionary breaking away from our great ape cousins is not reason, it's not truth, it's mimesis.
Boishalidi, if you are still here, now listen to this part. This is absolute brilliance right now, what's going to be discussed here. What separated us?
What defined for Girard our evolutionary breaking away from our great ape cousins is not reason, it's not truth, it's mimesis, our gradually increasing capacity and tendency for imitation. Now, the best metaphor I can think of to explain mimesis is that of co-vibrating violin strings. Now, when you put two violin strings together in close proximity, as you flick one, a similar frequency of vibration will translate to the other. And I think in a like manner, Girard identifies a species of human behavior. And here I use behavior, for the lack of a better word, in the largest sense possible. Actions, experiences, judgments, intentions that proceed also from copying an external instance of that behavior. Now, humans are social animals through and through, prone to this type of co-vibration, just as strings on a violin aren't independent. Neither.
Yeah, you always get vibes off of a person, right? And the violin example is so brilliant. It actually happens. If you or any string instrument for that matter, if you pluck any string, the string just near it also vibrates, which is why different shapes and sizes of guitar matter and give out different kinds of tones in a guitar.
Are we? Mimesis is the fundamental capacity and tendency to gain access to the subjectivity of others, as well as to reproduce objective cultural forms. In other words, mimesis is what constitutes us as social beings and makes us different from other animals. Mimesis, this tendency to ingest the behaviors and values, what have you, of those around us, is why perhaps prestige and recognition matter so much to us humans. You know, when a majority of a social group that you're immersed in believe something is good or beautiful or believe something should be done in this way or that, we tend to slowly take on and ingest those positions as well through mimesis. And I think our everyday notions of prestige already have an understanding of mimesis. When we say something is prestigious, we are perhaps also saying that on its own, it does not deserve the value we attribute to it. Right? When we call
Yes, just like music, musicians hate to admit this, but music has no implicit value. It only has explicit value, except to musicians themselves. For everyone else, music has no implicit value. Everyone listens to a piece of music because of what it says about them. You may like a music only because you think other people hate it, therefore you're trying to be the cool one for listening to that piece of music, or you're listening to a piece of music just because other people listen to it. Gravity, Nodaboli would always be not very prevalent. Nodaboli was always going to be pretty rare of an occurrence, because who is really going to supply all those humans? So if at all Nodaboli happened, I think it mainly happened with criminals, like that famous Dakat something Roy in Bangladesh. Although that was in the 1800s or 1700s, but even before that, Nodaboli was always going to be a rare occurrence only.
call prestigious,
বইটা the implicit and explicit মানে হলো implicit means inherently, is it, let's say food is actually for us, and therefore even animals need food, because it's implicitly valuable. You don't eat it, you die. But if you eat caviar and stuff, or fine dining, that food does not have implicit value really. That food has only explicit value, that is value assigned by outsiders, different kinds of opinion and discourse that has been created around that food, which is making that food valuable. Otherwise it's just dal bhat.
Rolex, Harvard, Bentley, maybe not Cornell, but the other actual prestigious things.
This guy has gone to Cornell, so he's trolling him. This part is so beautiful.
When we say something is prestigious, we are perhaps also saying that on its own, it does not deserve the value we attribute to it, right? When we call prestigious Rolex, Harvard, Bentley, maybe not Cornell, but the other actual prestigious things, partially what we're saying is that the value we attribute to it is not fully accounted for by the objects themselves.
Yeah.
But that there's some surplus value where the object doesn't deserve.
Yes.
Girard would say that surplus value does not come from the object,
Right.
but our peers valuing it and us ingesting their opinions
Our peers valuing it and us ingesting their opinions.
through mimesis. Now, for Girard, mimesis isn't everything, but everything to some degree is mimetic. The rush of adrenaline that infects you in a roaring and lively sporting stadium, the tribalism of politics, the madness of cults and how they sustain each other's delusions, the passing on of accents, even as animal, as an activity of replenishing ourselves, drinking water. We may still call to mind, however subtly, how our favorite athlete drinks Gatorade, right? That's the purpose of those commercials, to get that in your head. This is how broad and all-pervasive mimesis operates. Humanity, for Girard, would be completely unrecognizable without it.
Yeah, you see, we can't really get rid of mimesis because, okay, unless, again, humanity being irrecognizable is inherently a bad thing. Unless that is the case, we can't really get rid of it.
Species of a mimetic behavior that most concerns Girard in both senses of the word is desire. It's fine and dandy when what mimesis transmits is accents or cultural codes, but when mimesis converges the desires of people, well, that invites them into competition, conflict, and often...
Yes, gravity, dacoits used to give Narabali, but also often of specific invaders and raiders and stuff who were making Hindu lives hell, those kinds of things as well.
Violence. Girard separates the entirety of human desires into two species. The desire to be, which he terms metaphysical desire.
Good question. I'm not sure how developed are these societies. They are pretty primitive societies, right? If they are primitive and they are completely detached from outside food and stuff, and their society is not that developed, then they might not have mimesis. But I don't think any society, any human society is bereft of any mimesis at all, because I'll bet that those Sentinelese people wear some clothes, and the leader of the society probably wears a bit differently designed clothes than the rest of them. If that is the case, then they have mimesis.
And the desire to experience, which he terms physical desire. Metaphysical desire is directed at what objects say about me. Physical desire is directed at an experience confirmed by the qualities of the object itself.
Yes.
Desire into two species: the desire to be, which he terms metaphysical desire, and the desire to experience, which he terms physical desire. Metaphysical desire is directed at what objects say about me. Physical desire is directed at an experience confirmed by the qualities of the object itself. Let me give you a few examples to clarify. I can pursue, for example, sex for the experience out of physical desire, and what I would be after there would be pleasure or intimacy, feelings in the moment. But I can also pursue sex for being, what having sex with a certain type of person really says about me.
How are ape societies mimetic? I don't know much about them, but do they do the pointless violent things just as a way to signal their power, which is in fact pointless? And if they are doing pointless things just to signal, then of course they are mimetic as well.
Right? And this is a real psychology that people have. This is the psychology of the Don Juan or the coquette. For these people, sex is no longer about sex, but something more core to their identity.
Like House of Cards, Kevin Spacey's famous dialogue that everything is about sex except sex. Sex is about domination and signaling a bunch of other stuff. Boishali is saying iconoclasm and anti-mimetism, or is that cultivated artiness aimed towards look at me syndrome? Yes, that is the negative phase of mimesis. And they are the caste heterodox people that I talk about. Connecting my caste heterodox idea with René Girard helped me understand this. As I've explained many times, me becoming a case study for my own self is kind of creepy and weird, but it's just helping me understand these things better. So what can I do? So me as a middle caste guy who does not have a single middle caste friend or a lower caste friend, who is upwardly mobile economically because of 1991 liberalization and the betterment in the economic conditions of my parents, who also, and especially from one side, who also mostly had Brahman, Buddha, Kaisto friends. Now, when I'm making friends with Brahman, Buddhas and Kaistos, they are the caste heterodox ones. They are not doing the things that are usually done by Brahmans, Buddhas, Kaistos, okay? The Brahmans, Buddhas, Kaistos, whom I had as friends but did not stay my friends, are the ones who are not really caste heterodoxes. But the ones who are being caste heterodoxes, who are in the negative phase of mimesis, all of them, all from Brahmin caste, Buddha caste, and Kaisto caste, they are the only ones who are becoming my friends. So they are, I guess, a kind of downwardly mobile maybe, and I am upwardly mobile. Therefore, we are seeing a meeting point. And I make Brahmin, Buddha, Kaisto friends mainly from the Bengal community. That's also very telling. But even my Ghoti Brahmin friends are abso-fucking-lute caste heterodoxes, because and they are the ones who are in the negative phase of mimesis. They are saying that no, this is what's expected of me, this is the convention, and I won't do it that way. And by that I don't just mean rejecting any random Hindu rituals, by the way. Okay, I'm talking about my Brahmin friends who are not devoutly religious, but go through each and every ritual when expected of them. But they are going about their career in a different way. They're going about music in a different way. They're going about their dress up, even while doing music or otherwise, in a different way. That's when they are becoming caste heterodoxes.
They're not out there to experience something, but to prove something. Or take another more trivial and mundane example. I can buy a car for the experience, the trouble it would save me from walking everywhere, but I can also buy a car because I want to be a certain type of person, because I just want to have the coolest car on the block and have people admire me. You, for example, David, I must applaud you, because clearly from your car, I can tell that you're a very saintly man. Clearly, you do not care what the car says about you. You're
This was a fun part.
or the coquette. Having sex with a certain type of person really says about me, right? And this is a real psychology that people have. This is the psychology of the Don Juan or the coquette. For these people, sex is no longer about sex, but something more core to their identity. They're not out there to experience something, but to prove something. Or take another more trivial and mundane example. I can buy a car for the experience, the trouble it would save me from walking everywhere, but I can also buy a car because I want to be a certain type of person, because I just want to have...
I hate to interrupt this, but the comment section is also juicy, so I have to respond. So, Boishakidi, your question that what is caste heterodoxy is answered basically by Navavimarsha's comment here. That his consumption pattern is 360, he means 180, of course. 180 degrees opposite of the rest of the people in his caste. That's also the case with me. I forgot to mention this. I am also a caste heterodox. So, an upwardly mobile caste heterodox from the lower caste or the middle castes will, on his way upward, meet the caste heterodoxes from the upper castes and there have a meeting point and become friends with them.
Have the coolest card on the block and have people admire me. You, for example, David, I must applaud you because clearly from your car, I can tell that you're a very saintly man. Clearly, you do not care what the car says about you. You are freed from metaphysical desire in this domain. Congratulations.
I don't want to hear it. My Toyota's beautiful,
Yeah,
Jonathan.
yeah. Please don't stop driving me. A reductive, but hopefully illuminating way to put this is that physical desire aims at utility, whereas metaphysical desire aims at identity.
Oh,
Now, certainly,
Oh.
this boundary between
he brought in identity into this. This conversation and this way of thinking is so juicy. Do you understand? Isn't that the case? And remember, when it comes to identity, that's where culture comes in. Culture, with or without religion, without the idea of religion, okay, culture can in fact be practiced or talked about, even acknowledged, without continuously attaching it to religion, because religion, in fact, or the idea of God can be personal, but culture is never personal because meaning is not personal. Culture and identity is meaning.
experience in being between utility and identity.
Again, that is the idea of Hindutva even. Okay, why consider this land or Rig Veda sacred? Yes, we can get into real world answers of that this culture and this country, this land made our ancestors and us the way we are, etc. But a bit of it is just saving your identity, which again, to which we are being pushed by another side who are exporting their desert modalities.
Identity is not so clear. Who we conceive ourselves to be colors our experiences as much as our experiences, if ever so subtly, shapes our self-conception. But just think about how drastically different these experiences are. Right? Think about pursuing a profession because the work is engaging versus doing it because it's the right job to have, or dating a person because you like spending time with them versus dating some person because you like to be seen with them.
Right. That's very important. Okay, relax leads question here. Doesn't caste heterodoxy also have some undertones? And upper caste heterodox person might still be subject to beliefs, exactly, absolutely, that he or she was indoctrinated into, and same is for all others. Yes, all of them were indoctrinated into a certain way of life, but some of them negated it, some of them didn't. The ones who did negate it had the same teachings, but only negated that way of life, and therefore they were in the negative phase of mimesis. So they didn't really quit being mimetic, by the way. Okay, going in the opposite direction does not mean you were able to quit it. That is the fun aspect of this way of thinking. They are what René Girard calls in the negative phase of mimesis, and the ones who are in the negative phase of mimesis, they are the ones who are caste heterodox.
Or traveling to a place because you're interested in the culture, or because you just want to be seen in the coolest locale. Clearly, the distinction that Girard has drawn here, if a bit muddied, is nonetheless meaningful, especially at the extremes. This desire to be at the heart of metaphysical desire is aimed at a fullness of being. We want to exist, Girard believes, in great measure. Metaphysical desire takes form as a pursuit of objects, in the broadest sense of the term. Wanted to climb Mount Everest, wanted to build a unicorn company, wanted to study at an Ivy League, or, more mundane, buying a particular car, dating Sally instead of Susan, enjoying a fancy restaurant. But
and why do you think NRI parents put their children into Western classical music and tennis and stuff to go upward in the caste ladder of USA, of course?
in all of these experiences, Girard would say it's never objects we are really after.
Yes.
I don't think this is a foreign concept to our this worldly, achievement-focused consumer society. We want to acquire objects to bolster and back up our identity. And the way we go about choosing which objects to go after, Girard believes, is imitating individuals whom we already consider to possess this fullness of being. Celebrities, parental figures, entrepreneurs, an outstanding coworker. We take on their desires as our own. the objects they value as the objects we also strive for. The faulty logic here being that it must be the acquisition of these objects that grant these models the fullness of their being.
Yeah, this reminds me of celebrity advertisements.
It does indeed, right? You see a celebrity and you want what they want. That's the whole logic behind these advertisements. And I think the one line in celebrity advertisement that gives it all away is the tagline for Michael Jordan's sneakers, "Be like Mike." What it's promising you isn't just a product or utility, but the being and prestige.
Yes, becoming Michael Jordan, getting the vibe of being or existing as in the world as Michael Jordan. That's the point of those shoes.
Michael Jordan, so that you can have a piece of that as well.
Right.
It's not jump like Mike.
Right.
It's not score like Mike. The advertisement of basketball shoes doesn't talk about anything of the most important physical qualities of the basketball shoes, of the lightness, the grip, the bounce. It's promising you something you want all the more. Be like Mike. Girard's central thesis is that what often appears to be a subject pulled towards an object due to the intrinsic value of that object is really the subject wanting to acquire that object to be like some model. What we are really after isn't the object, but the being of the model. Whereas we think of desire as unidirectional, flowing from subject to object. Girard thinks it's actually triangular, proceeding from subject through a model to the object. Now, because what is at stake in metaphysical desire is our identity, it is the strongest drive in the human motivational repertoire.
Yeah, we are discussing motivations here, and this question is pertinent here. So, Hindi hatred and Urdu love signals that you are in favor of minorities, you are in favor of the Islamicate culture, and therefore you are somehow greater and a better person because you are in favor of Islamicate culture, which is celebrated in society because of Bollywood taking it up, Bollywood being the most powerful medium because of, again, Maharashtra or Mumbai's economy. So economics was in play all the time, but after economics is a trigger point, it stops being everything. Economics stops being the mother and father and everything about the topic. That's the problem. That's the problem with calling castes simply class. Yes, economics does matter in caste, but then it stops being all about economics. So unless we are going to talk about only the source and not diagnose all the things that happened later, we can't talk about caste as if it's class. So in the same way, Hindi hatred means hating UP's regressive culture, etc. Even though today UP is probably safer than West Bengal, especially during elections. So the idea doesn't change immediately, right? Which is why if someone says, "Are you a moral relativist?" I will probably never answer that question in one sentence or in one word. Because yes, I believe on an individual level, there is objective morality, but in a macro sense, on a global scale, there is, factually speaking, no objective morality, because the guy doing a bad thing is doing a good thing according to someone else. And both of them are being moral. Now, Hindi hatred is to signal hatred for UP and Bihar. Urdu love is to portray their love for Shah Rukh Khan, A.R. Rahman and Javed Akhtar.
I think it's quite obvious when we are motivated by such a drive because we can become obsessed and compulsive. We think that achievement, obtaining the objects that metaphysical desire wants, will fully transform us. I think in different stages of our lives, metaphysical desire usually directs us toward.
I would not have a problem with the observation. I do have a problem with the framing of this because I hate the word exploitation because it takes away the agency of someone doing it out of consent. Yes, that consent may be distorted because of mimesis and psychology and everything else. But after all, it is a consent. And if we don't even value consent, we are going to head nowhere in society. And which is why I was saying yesterday with the live streams that got fucked, that yes, some people will allege that Mr. Sociologist and I are postmodernists. But unlike postmodernists, we do take power seriously. We do think, yes, there are power hierarchies, but power is not inherently evil, at least not according to me. I think power does come out of competence. So if you just say, oh, that's a power hierarchy, therefore that's inherently evil, then I'm not with you.
Towards a limited set of objects. For me, first, it was a specific toy that I really wanted. and then a weapon in World of Warcraft, and then dating a person, and then an Ivy League, etc., etc. I think we're always oriented at different stages in our lives towards something.
Exactly.
And these are the objects pointed to by metaphysical desire. These are objects in each period of our life that take on a disproportionate weight, such that you define progress as inching towards the object. And whenever it slips away, however subtly, however minutely, your heart just thuds and you feel a deep existential despair.
Romance provides a good example here. Often you won't even be after the woman that you're interested in, and you won't be that interested. And what'll happen is all of a sudden there's another suitor who comes along and they are interested in this woman, and all of a sudden you get excited about this person.
Yeah, and the extreme form of it is the cuckoldness phenomenon, that your valuing of your wife is so tied to outside validation of your wife that in the end you stop even having sex with your wife, and in fact like to watch your wife having sex with someone else.
Too, and it is in that competition that we are inflamed.
Good question. I don't know what's the exact academic definition of exploitation, but based on English grammar, exploitation seems to be something that happens to you without your consent. But if there is consent, and commies and Marxists go on calling everything and anything exploitation, that annoys me.
Aimed by the mimetic spirit. But then there's a second point here about this existential dread that we can feel. You ever feel those tremendous highs and lows in the early stages of talking to a woman or something, and you'll be so excited because the texting is going well, you'll be skipping down the halls, and then all of a sudden she won't respond. And you're freaking out, you're texting your friends what's going on here, you can't sleep that night, and you wake up in the next morning, your alarm clock goes off, and you see a text, and she's responded. Now you jump out of bed and you wake up faster than a double shot of espresso.
That's precisely the right example to think of. In fact, Girard would commonly go to romance as his canonical examples of metaphysical desire. And these two qualities you mentioned. First, the object not contributing anything or too much to desire, as well as these bipolar swings, all make romance, or at least the iterations you described, as textbook examples of metaphysical desire. And look, Girard's point is, even in as intimate a domain as romance, our desires are, if you'd excuse a pun, helplessly penetrated by those of others. Even our desires for our partners tend not to be informed fully by our partners, but by people around them. Girard's point is, if even such a personal desire...
And that was the point of arranged marriages, right? That the parents signal it properly, get you a guy or girl who's in your caste, but unknowingly in your status group. But then when it gets distorted and castes are no longer, your traditional castes are no longer, let's say, analogous to your current status in society, that's when the bad arranged marriages start happening, and therefore people reject arranged marriages but go about marrying in their own status group anyway. But the point of arranged marriages was that you being a horny guy or woman and being infatuated with someone, don't fuck up your marriage by getting married outside your status group.
Can be so external in origin, then the same must also be true for other domains as well.
Yes, Gravity, that's still exploitation, because when the cheating happened, that didn't happen with your consent.
Career choice, political orientation, aesthetic taste, philosophical opinions. This is a full... Girard's point is, if even such a personal desire can be so external in origin, then the same must also be true for other domains as well. Career choice, political orientation, aesthetic taste, philosophical opinions. This is a full-scale attack on the modern conception of individuals who can form their own decisions through reason, who have an authentic core of desires to tap into. Now, if this attack was not already threatening enough, Girard's next point will make it all the more so and further problematize authenticity. Just as mimesis and metaphysical desire can make people conform, they can also make people diverge.
Yes.
Put in another way,
This topic of diverging is negative phase of mimesis, and then here you will find analogies to my arguments of being a caste heterodox. Okay, check it out.
even a breaking away from the group in a
Right.
so-called carving one's own path
Mhm.
can be radically socially determined. I mean, think about it like this. The logic of metaphysical desire is to pursue the objects associated with those who do have a fullness of being, right? And so a natural continuation of this logic is to avoid or distance oneself from objects associated with those we conceive to be as having a deficiency in being. We both want to be like the cool kids, but also distant and be different from the social outcasts. Here's an example. The tech elite with their plain t-shirts are not independent from Girard's perspective from the status games of finance finally addressed elite. Even though they appear to be rejecting that game, in reality, it's merely the continuation of the same game in a more accelerated form.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it like this. Showing up with a $5 t-shirt to a dinner where everyone was wearing $500 suits is, in some sense, much more of a power play than showing up with a $5,000 suit to the same dinner. Because it's saying that I'm so much better than you, that we aren't even playing the same game, that I take your highest values, what you hold most dear, is vulgar, as nothing. This is the logic of the negative phase of mimesis.
And that is, by the way, asceticism as well.
To distance oneself in order to show one's superiority.
Yeah.
This breaking away from a group is no more authentic or independent than conformity, because your choices are still made for what.
And you see, everyone who has friends in JNU or JU will know this. This was discussed in Sandeep Sanyal's that famous hilarious story that I read out as well. That they are conformists in a non-conformists in a very conformist way. They have their special secluded ghettos of non-conformity where they are conforming to each other, which is why I get annoyed with libertarians who let's say shit their pants at the very mention of collectivism. Okay, yes, laws must not be collectivist, but you can't negate or refuse to acknowledge anything and everything that's remotely collectivist, because you libertarians are all negating collectivism in the exact same way.
They say about you and not the object itself. Now, in my own life decisions, if I may share a bit of a personal story, I think I've been led astray by both the positive and the negative forces of mimesis. You know, I grew up idolizing entrepreneurs, the Steve Jobs of the world, and as soon as I got into college, I felt like I had to drop out and start a company ASAP. And so I did. My freshman spring, I dropped out, I raised a small round, and the company crashed and burned out of vanity. And it's not that I didn't enjoy building companies. That's not why I was led astray by mimesis, but the degree to which I desired it and the urgency of which I felt like I had to achieve it, not unlike your romance example, was disproportionate to the value of the object itself.
Very good question, Rishi. Now, sorry to make trads the punching bags, but I'm not using trads as a gali here, but traditionalists would argue that they are playing, they're not playing the game. They have renounced the game. I would argue, and people like mysterious sociologists would argue, they are in fact playing a higher game, because they are saying that your game doesn't even matter to me, therefore I'm not playing it. But I would argue that subconsciously they are playing a higher game.
In other words, I desired being an entrepreneur and not necessarily the processes of building a company. Now, when I did go back to school as a sophomore, a semester later,
to be more precise, yes, actually both of these apply. They are not playing the game, but by not playing the game, they are playing a higher game.
Resentment disproportionate to the value of the object itself. I didn't enjoy building companies. That's not why I was led astray by mimesis, but the degree to which I desired it and the urgency of which I felt like I had to achieve it, not unlike your romance example, was disproportionate to the value of the object itself. In other words, I desired being an entrepreneur and not necessarily the processes of building a company.
No, Rishi, that would be true if aesthetics did not get any respect.
Now, when I did go back to school as a sophomore, a semester later, out of resentment for my peers who had dropped out and did build successful companies, I think I went the other direction, rejecting the worldly altogether, switching from CS to philosophy, going to a Buddhist monastery. For 3 years, I didn't do that much at all in industry out of resentment. Now, rejecting industry and building companies was my moral weapon to secure victory over my more successful peers, to turn my failure into a triumph. But this was equally, if not more, inauthentic and perverse. Now, The same story goes. It's not that I didn't enjoy philosophy and Buddhism. The degree to which I pursued it, and certainly the degree to which I renounced the world, was not genuine. It wasn't reflective of how much I liked philosophical and meditative practice, and certainly not how much I disliked the worldly, active life of industry.
Rishi, people who are secluded forever and after, who never again see the face of society, who live absolutely alone forever and after in a secluded place, in a remote hilly area and stuff, they have probably moved on from it and are focusing on their bigger game of attaining moksha. They can be considered out of our discussion, but even then the moksha matter still remains. But even those secluded ascetics will meet other ascetics who will then give him extra respect for being a secluded ascetic, or at least meet at Kumbh Mela every now and then. So therefore they are still in the negative phase of mimesis. They are negating society.
And I think I really did miss out on valuable career opportunities because I was too resentful to engage. This carving of my own path was just as socially determined. It was a form of coping so that I didn't have to feel lesser than my more successful peers. As a society, I think we all recognize this first move of conforming to this dropout culture as socially determined, as prestige-seeking, as not authentic. But I think the second move of rejecting the group is just as socially determined, in that it was still primarily the relationships with people that determined my choices, not for the choices themselves. Admiration led me to converge in the first case, and resentment led me to diverge in the second.
Yes.
The direction is different, but the essence is the same.
Oh, this is my point. What a brilliant explanation, man.
Relationships with people that determined my choices, not for the choices themselves. Admiration led me to converge in the first case, and resentment led me to diverge in the second. The direction is different, but the essence is the same.
So you see, mimesis is Sanatan. Whether you will copy or negate the object you could have copied, that's not Sanatan.
Of course, in our society, to break away from the group, to carve one's own path, so to speak, is thought to be a sure sign of independence. That is not so. Girard here is trying to tear down what he conceives of as the romantic lie. The lie goes something like this. At the bottom, we're all individuals with a core of what we can call the authentic self. And then there are these layers of social constraints, one on top of the other, with the origins external. The way to access authenticity, so this romantic lie goes, is by following one's heart with a bold breaking free of the group, peeling away of these social layers. Girard says, not so fast. This breaking free from the group can be just as socially determined as rigid
Absolutely.
adherence. You're confusing.
Yes, because अगर socially determined नहीं होता किस चीज को negate करता? अगर तुम साड़ी के बदले में जीन्स पहन के बोल रहे हो कि तुम independent हो, and if no one asked you not to wear a jeans, or no one promoted the idea of wearing a sari, then you would not really wear that jeans.
Difference for autonomy. You're confusing distance for independence.
This sentence is phenomenal.
Of these social layers. Girard says, not so fast. This breaking free from the group can be just as socially determined as rigid adherence. You're confusing difference for autonomy. You're confusing distance for independence, and you're confusing originality for freedom. The reality is, we can just as easily be socially determined by rejecting a group out of resentment as we can confusing difference for autonomy. You're confusing distance for independence, and you're confusing difference for autonomy.
Right. You are just different. You still don't have autonomy.
You're confusing distance for independence, and you're confusing.
You just have created distance from a sari. You don't have independence from sari because you still care about the sari enough to not wear it and wear a jeans, which is often more uncomfortable. And of course, definitely sometimes comfortable.
Originality for freedom.
Yes, you may have originality, you don't have freedom from those ideas.
The reality is, we can just as easily be socially determined by rejecting a group out of resentment as we can by conforming to the group out of admiration or peer pressure.
Right.
Mimesis operates positively and negatively. Mimesis and metaphysical desire, then, entrap us in every direction, both in conforming as well as in breaking free. Man is shown to be a social creature through and through. If you take one thing from Girard's psychology, it is this: the most powerful and explanatory element within the human psyche is our sociality. Our values, our political orientation, aesthetic taste, and even philosophical positions are heavily, often primarily, determined by others in deep and often unconscious ways.
Right. And that's why Savarkar is the best kept secret of Congress. If anyone and everyone started reading Savarkar, a whole lot more people would immediately become Hindutvadis. Savarkar is the biggest danger that Congress has even today. like always it had been, at least especially for today's generation. Gravity saying, I've seen people in Tamil Nadu that they wear white, like most could be because of heat. Yeah, definitely because of heat. White shirt, white dhoti, or white shirt, black pant. Is that mass asceticism as well, conscious or unconscious? There I think comes the idea of morality being convenience at one point. So definitely mimesis, not necessarily asceticism, because I don't know Tamil Nadu culture all that much. And so white is definitely more convenient and more there are socially assigned values of wearing white anyway. But then it's white is the best thing to wear in insane heat, and then people just consider it a better and the right or the moral thing to wear. And then people like us, dumb crazy metalheads who wear black fucking t-shirts in 40 degree and 45 degree heat, we are the idiots who are doing the negative phase of mimesis. Like when I used to go to band competitions in June and July and stuff. Before that though, I was so dumb, I used to wear a black t-shirt all day. But then I grew some brains, and in 2012 2013 I started carrying a black t-shirt just for the half an hour that I would be on stage in the July heat and the June heat. The rest of the time I would be wearing a white t-shirt,
chosen for their own sake.
Because that black t-shirt is conforming to other metalheads, but then non-conforming to the rest of society.
Philosophical positions are heavily, often primarily, determined by others in deep and often unconscious ways, and not chosen for their own sake. We may think our desires are our own. We may think we desire our spouse just because of who they are, or at the very least because of their physical attractiveness. But Girard shows that even this turns out not to be the full extent of the story. We may think reason can hold the reins and guide our decisions, but this social dimension of ourselves is often much, much stronger. Reason pretends to be its steward, but in reality is its lawyer and spokesperson.
Oh, this is probably my favorite sentence in this entire lecture. Reason, justification only pretends to be the cause, pretends to be the steward, but in reality, reason is simply the lawyer. And by the way, Rishi, I think being a Jitendriya is a nice goal to have, but I consider mimesis to be so inevitable. So I'm again, let's specify that. Do I think it's feasible versus not feasible, or is it good versus not good? I think Jitendriya is a good idea, but I don't think it's a feasible idea, because you must strive to become a Jitendriya as much as possible. But even if you attain full Jitendriya, becoming a Jitendriya, you will probably get the benefits of becoming a Jitendriya. So you will still signal that yes, see, I'm a Stoic. See, I'm Jitendriya now.
Mention of ourselves is often much, much stronger. Reason pretends to be its steward, but in reality is its lawyer and spokesperson, engaged in, more often than not, post hoc rationalization. Oh, yeah.
Right. Polymath Jitendriya is the idea of Indriya Jaya, conquering all your senses. So the idea of Stoicism, basically.
Of course, I want to be an entrepreneur because I want to change the world for the better.
In this context, there are consistently 36 people watching right now, combined from YouTube and Twitter. So I'll hope they stay with me. In this context, I think let's check out the poem "If" by Rudyard Kipling, which is, according to me, the greatest poem ever written, at least in English. I've not read the English translations of Gita and stuff, so I won't. Although Gita is hardly just a poem. So let me just read out "If" by Rudyard Kipling. we will get an understanding of being a Jitendriya and being a stoic to a large extent because of this poem. ये चूतिया zoom नहीं होगा क्या? एक मिनट, कहाँ से पढ़ेंगे, देखते हैं. Yes, Rishi, that's the problem with asceticism. Even when you give up all your indriyas, that one indriya doesn't go away. That, see, I conquered my lust, I conquered my hunger, I conquered my flimsy happiness and sadness at all things. I conquered all those senses, but एक रह जाएगा according to me. अरे कहाँ से मिलेगा poem? Yeah, this poem is so awesome. And I had this in school syllabus, and that's the only poem I've ever liked that was in my syllabus. So, if the entire poem is about if you can in fact be Jitendriya, that's the angle of the poem. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can be calm when everyone is blaming you and losing their own head, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but also make allowance for their doubting too. Here again, the idea of not being an absolutist dumb fuck, as Nietzsche would have liked. If you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or if you can be lied about and even then don't deal in lies, or even or if you on being hated, don't become a hater yourself. And if you don't look too good and not talk too wise, if you do those things, and the what happens if these things happen, that's the last sentence, of course. Then the list goes on. If you can dream but not just become a daydreaming lazy loser, if you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think but if you also do action, if you also take action and not make thoughts your aim, okay, you must think, but thinking should not be your sole end goal. Thoughts should not be your aim. If you can meet triumph and disaster, and he calls them two imposters, okay, imposters. Triumph is an imposter, disaster is also an imposter. And if you treat those two imposters in the same way, if you can bear to hear the truth you have spoken, and if you can hear it even when it is, even when your truth, the truth that you spoke, is twisted by assholes to make a trap for fools, even then, or if you can watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with even worn out tools, if you can make a heap of all your winnings and risk in one turn of pitch and toss, एक जुआ में अगर तुम वो risk कर सकते हो, and lose even if you lose, and if then go on to start again at your very beginnings, and also never breathe a word about your loss. You don't even have to make a fuss about it. If you can force your heart and nerve and bones and sinew, every fiber of your being, to serve your turn long after they're gone, even if your turn is gone, even then, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to wait for your turn and still go on with your project. And so hold on when, listen to this sentence. This is a phenomenal sentence. So if you can hold on when there is nothing in you except that will, which goes on saying, hold on. When there's nothing in you except just that willpower saying, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, if you talk to crowds and don't become an idiotic group thinker like them, or if you walk with kings and not stop talking to the common people just because you met one cool famous person, you stop talking to other non-cool non-famous persons, if you can do that, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men can count with you but not too much, you don't become a pushover. If you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, then if all these things are taken care of, then yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And which is more, you will be a man, my son.
Reason pretends to be its steward, but in reality is its lawyer and spokesperson. engaged in, more often than not, post hoc rationalization. Oh yeah, of course, I want to be an entrepreneur because I want to change the world for the better. Or on the other hand, of course, I would never be an entrepreneur because industry is vulgar and capitalism is evil. The reasons we give for our decisions often come after we've already sworn allegiance to those decisions due to ulterior social motives. Now, for Girard, our mimetic natures, the extent to which we are socially determined, is what differentiates us from animals and the main direction of human evolution from ape. This direction of evolution is not, as commonly thought, the increase of our ability to reason and grasp truth. After all, Girard would say, other animals engage in truth-seeking behaviors as well. There's echolocation, there's tapping into magnetic fields, there's night vision. These are all truth-seeking activities.
Right.
But we are the only animals who create gods, who tell stories, who spin up fictions, who would go to war for an abstract conception of honor which we can neither taste nor smell nor touch, who would trade food and shelter for pieces of paper, who would
Because all of that signals something about you, and animals don't care about signaling.
die for myths and gods that clearly never even existed. Animals are the sober ones. We are the nut jobs. What makes us unique for Girard is not our ability to determine truth, but our capacity to believe in lies insofar as
What a sentence.
what makes them taste nor smell nor touch, who would trade food and shelter for pieces of paper, who would die for myths and gods that clearly never even existed. Animals are the sober ones. We are the nut jobs. What makes us unique for Girard is not our ability to determine truth, but our capacity to believe in lies insofar as others around us do as well.
Yeah.
For the modern mind, this is a deeply alien conception of human nature, and it opens a Pandora's box of questions.
Yeah.
What does it mean to protect?
That is the problem. That is the problem with thinking like Nietzsche or René Girard. Imagine the Pandora's box that's going to be opened in your mind tomorrow morning onwards. And you are going to question everything around you. ये तो बहुत ठीक है, ये तो signal दे रहा है, ये तो अच्छा इसमें तो वो signal है. So imagine how gigantic of a skeptic you will become. तो वहाँ पे हमको याद रखना है कि being skeptic for just the heck of it is again not the goal. We are looking for useful outcomes for ourselves and our society, our country, everything, and our family. So we will get a great dose of skepticism in our brains from thinking this way, but that should not be the end all be all, which has often happened to people. They have gone mad reading Nietzsche.
Individual freedom. If we, like co-vibrating violin strings, are never truly free to begin with, how can we follow our own authentic desires if every part of our psyche is so helplessly external in its origin? How is the democratic process not as arbitrary as the whims of a single dictator if we are so easily influenced and swayed by the mob? These will have to remain questions for now, wrestled with over the course of the next 7 lectures, because mimesis presents us a much more pressing and threatening problem in this evolutionary story that we must now turn to. Everything we've talked about up until this point, what we've discussed so far, are the core psychological faculties that define humanity. Now, let us jump back into Girard's history to see the unique challenges which this psychology brings about. We are officially moving from psychology to history. As early humans evolved to be more and more mimetic, the simple dominance hierarchies that were able to contain animal groups started breaking down. The idea goes something like this. Dominance hierarchies, where there's a clear chain of alpha to beta to gamma all the way to omega, works fine if there's little mimesis. Insofar as the beta doesn't desire what the alpha has, and the gamma doesn't desire what the beta has, then all is well. But the mimetic tendency of early humans started to become so strong that there started to be frequent cross-pollination of desires across the hierarchy. Metaphysical desire, at least the strength of it, is unique to humans, and this lets subjects to enter into rivalry with their models. Converging and competing metaphysical desires would rip social groups apart in wars of all against all, destroying all those societies that were involved. Girard reasons that the only hominoid groups that survived and formed lasting cultures were ones that stumbled upon a unique cultural technology to stop this escalating conflict. And that he called the scapegoat mechanism.
Ha ha. Holy shit. Do you see the repercussions of what he just said in context to Hinduism and Shaktism and Bali Pratha? And now tie this together to what Rajarshi Nandi says about Bhairava.
Girard reasons that the only hominoid groups that survived and formed lasting cultures were ones that stumbled upon a unique cultural technology to stop this escalating conflict. And that he called the scapegoat mechanism. Now, in the midst,
Rishi, scapegoating is to sort of collectively kill someone as part of a ceremony to not only signal to each other that yes, we are prepared for violence, but also to celebrate that all our violent instincts we sort of transmitted into that one animal, and we that inevitable desire for violence that got, for now, let's say that desire met its end by killing that goat, and also as a preparation for any violent activity later on when it might be required to protect the society. And that, according to René Girard, is a necessary or a key cultural technology for any society to survive. And hence, Buddhism was relegated to the sidelines. And also, this is why I say, and I'm going on noticing that materialistic understanding of philosophy or Hinduism does not necessarily make you an anti-Hindu atheist. That's not what it's doing to me. Maybe because of the base I got in understanding Hinduism from Sri Aurobindo's book Life Divine, and because of people like Savarkar. But they are fruitful ways of understanding Hinduism regardless.
Of such a war of all against all, cultures were ones that stumbled upon a unique that were involved. Girard reasons that the only hominoid groups that survived and formed lasting cultures were ones that stumbled upon a unique cultural technology to stop this escalating conflict. And that he called the scapegoat mechanism.
And all I'm saying is that right now, killing that goat specifically, that can be moved on from. I'm alleging. I'm not giving gyan to traditionalists here or devout Shaktas here. I'm saying that I think it's in a situation in 2024-25. I think we can move on from goat scapegoating, because evidence shows that it's not getting us those benefits that René Girard was saying that these societies have. So you see, now it's become only and only a signal with zero real life value.
Reasons that the only hominoid groups that survived and formed lasting cultures were ones that stumbled upon a unique cultural technology to stop this escalating conflict. And that he called the scapegoat mechanism. Now, in the midst of such a war of all against all, think a civil war, a French Revolution, when society is in utter chaos, societies, Girard observes, often converge upon a single victim or a small set of victims, attributing to them all the blame and frustrations of the chaos that they're in.
Now, is this like a rational process similar to the way that a jury sentences a victim? Or what should I have in mind here?
Yeah, it's not a rational process. It's not a committee that, say, picks the victim, but a somewhat random process where certain accusations against certain people just start gaining steam until the whole group falls under its spell. Think about the randomness of the French Revolution rather than a calculated drone strike. I think that's what you should have in mind here. This victim, if not fully innocent.
Right. So you see, therefore, I guess when it does in fact become a committee selected rational process, that's when it stops being effective. And therefore, I think we can move on from beyond the court. Because when in fact it was a non-rational process, I guess it stopped being a rational process. It started being a rational process very pretty soon. But at one point, it might not have been a committee selected rational process. And at that point, people were ardently of the belief that our gods and goddesses of war are absolutely happy. And then you get the psychological satisfaction and confidence that, yes, the war gods are happy because we sacrificed this animal. Now let's go to war and fuck our enemies up. But with time, if that belief flails, and it's so manicured and curated, that scapegoating mechanism, then it stops doing its intended job, which was furtherance and survival of that community. It just becomes a museum artifact, a cosplaying, a fancy dress competition.
Certainly does not deserve the extent of the blame leveled on him. This group is always deceitful, and their certainty is only bolstered by unanimity, the fact that everyone believes in the victim's guilt. This victim will be expelled, often murdered very brutally, as the group...
Savarkar was a scapegoat, one such scapegoat that Indian society sacrificed in order to do their post-47 nation building. The trads gave up on Savarkar because of the way he talked about rituals. And Congress was, of course, even the atheists and the commies were happy to hate on Savarkar anyway. Savarkar is a very, very clear example of society's scapegoat.
Group gains a cathartic release and peace is restored. There are, unfortunately, too many examples of innocent scapegoats throughout human history. Think about Socrates' trial and death at the hands of the Athenian jury. Think about the Black Death, which is blamed on witches and witchcraft. Think about the Nazis scapegoating the Jews for German decline. Think about McCarthy-era witch hunts, persecuting innocents under the crimes of communism. It's not enough, Girard reasons, for us to find guilty parties, but we want to find one radical source of evil to blame everything upon. With the scapegoat.
Rishi, in reality, no. But the specific texts that use insanely vile words for lower castes, those specific texts written, the people who wrote those specific texts, they might have tried to do the scapegoating of them, but in the end, caste system remained a status hierarchy distinction.
Mechanism. Girard is highlighting the perennial need of human societies in times of chaos to identify a single source to blame and murder. To truly establish a peaceful society in a time of turmoil, this murder must be maximally cathartic, and as a result, has to be...
Because, Rishi, the scapegoating means that ultimately the bully needs to happen, no? Either metaphorically or physically, that idea or that person needs to die off. And no one has really, I think, called for the genocide of lower castes, and therefore they were never intended to be simply scapegoats.
Maximally violent and deceitful, often blaming a singular victim for the entirety of the society's problems. And Girard thinks that this murder...
Rishi, Hindutva, maybe some in Hindutva are trying to scapegoat minorities because scapegoating would imply that we put all the blame on this one particular problem, which you and I are not doing. We are also talking about state control, bureaucracy, economics. So we are definitely not scapegoating minorities.
Is wrong.
See, libertarians, they are scapegoating the economy and the Babu. They are not considering any other problems.
It's a lie, that it's regrettable, that it should not be done, but it worked. And it was the only thing that worked, which kept early human societies alive. Now, to make sense of Girard's claim here, because this is quite a radical claim on the violent foundations of society, we must go back and think about Girard's psychology. For every social philosophy, I would wager that we must ask who the subject is, right? For Marx, the subject is class. For fascism, it is the nation state. For Augustine, it is a Christian soul. For liberalism, it is a rational agent. Girard's subject of his social philosophy is the spirited animal. Not one who thinks in terms of utility and numbers, but vengeance and pride, honor and being, who experiences envy and resentment. Now, for such a social creature, the primary mechanisms that govern him isn't consensus. It's not the mandate of heaven. It's not the common good. It's certainly not rational political discourse. For Girard, we aren't rational agents interested in a systematic analysis and nuanced solution, but social spirited creatures needing a cathartic release, into
Yeah.
radical evil.
Yes.
In moments of extreme turbulence, we aren't interested in truth, but a grand lie and founding murder that can grant us catharsis. The lie, however, goes even further. While this no longer happens in modernity for reasons that we'll have to explore a bit later on, in early pagan societies, the peace that descended unto the crowd would be so miraculous, so instantaneous and unbelievable that people would struggle to make sense of what had just happened. How did we go from being at each other's throats to being fully reconciled? And so, just as deceitfully as the crowd would blame the victim for causing chaos, they now
Um, Rishi, one could argue that the Sattvic Bhava way of doing Bali, which is the cutting down of watermelon, that was the intended scapegoating. But the Vaishnavas, as R.C. Majumdar points out, ended up scapegoating Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself. कि 100 साल में जो चैतन्य महाप्रभु काजी के घर के सामने खड़ा होकर बोल रहा है कि काजी बाहर आ तेरा गला काटूंगा, 100 साल बाद he is just an effeminate, random, nice, cute, devout guy. So Vaishnavas, if at all we can credit to Vaishnavas surviving, if at all they survived effectively, at least in Bengal, that happened by scapegoating Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself. Ramakrishna Mission, they scapegoat other stuff, and even Bengali society as a whole has scapegoated Ramakrishna by depicting him again in a crazy Down syndrome, retarded kid sort of a way.
from being at each other's throats to being fully reconciled. And so, just as deceitfully as the crowd would blame the victim for causing chaos, they now deceitfully praise the now dead victim for ending the chaos, turning the victim, paradoxically, into a god. Girard's point is that the scapegoat mechanism is such a unanimous process.
Dekha.
People feel so justified in their expulsion that they don't even feel their own agency. And so they don't see themselves as bringing peace. All they have in view is the victim and reasons that it must be the victim that has brought us that peace. The victim must be a god. These pagan gods are all powerful, with the power to begin and end destruction. These gods are seen as both good and evil. The example Girard will point to is the story of Oedipus, as told by Sophocles. Now, we're going to spend an entire lecture with Oedipus, but let me give you a very, very brief outline first. And Oedipus is a new king of Thebes that is being ravished by a plague. Oedipus is guilty of having committed both patricide, which is the killing of one's father, as well as incest, having sex with one's mother. And because of this, the entire city blames Oedipus for causing the plague and expels him. The people get their catharsis and the plague goes away. Now, Oedipus wanders the Greek states, and as time progresses, something very, very strange happens. Rather than only being an object of scorn that everyone wants to expel, to distance from, people are now competing to invite Oedipus into their lands. See, a prophecy has gained momentum in Greece that wherever Oedipus's remains will be buried shall be granted lasting peace.
A bit of it can be applied to this idea can be applied to those Brahmins we were discussing in the Declan Quigley papers, for example in Nepal and some places in South India, that the one who does the last rites of the king, subconsciously speaking, sort of takes away all the evil or the non-hygienic aspects of death and stuff upon himself, but then therefore is given a lot of money, is given an elephant, but then is kicked out of the country, of the kingdom.
And in this Oedipus myth, then, we see both movements of the scapegoat mechanism. Right? First, we see the scapegoating. Oedipus might have been morally bankrupt for patricide and incest, but it was certainly an exaggerated lie to think that he was the cause of the entire plague. Right? His expulsion was a groundless lie. Second, we see the movement of divinization. As Oedipus's expulsion brought about lasting peace through catharsis, he started to gain a dual character. Still evil for causing the plague, but also radically good with the power to end plagues and bring peace. Oedipus, at the end of the story, has been divinized, or at least fetishized. Girard's claim is that in all pagan religions, we can find traces of a once victim turned god at the foundation of the culture. We will investigate in due course across this entire lecture series. The Nordic myth of Baldur's death that resembles a collective expulsion, the Greek myth of the birth of Zeus and its eerie similarities to murder, and the Hindu hymn to Purusha, where a Genesis deity is sacrificed with his remains giving birth to Hindu society and its castes. It's not just religions, however, that are born from the scapegoat mechanism, but pagan culture and society as well. I mean, take the example of Julius Caesar, who's the victim turned god of the Roman Imperium. In the story of Caesar, we also find the key movements of the scapegoat mechanism.
Therefore, Savarkar is now a god, I guess. At least, as I was saying in a recent live stream, that Savarkar has sort of become my personal monotheistic god, in the sense that I have a monotheist's reaction when someone disrespects or talks shit about Savarkar.
Right. First, Roman society is in a state of utter chaos and civil war. Julius Caesar is famously scapegoated, blamed, and collectively murdered on the Senate floor. Now, peace does not come immediately to Rome indeed, but it does come at the hand of another Caesar, Caesar Augustus, Julius's nephew. And so with Augustus's victory, Julius Caesar is literally deified, recognized as a literal god by the Roman Senate, and becomes a fountainhead of Roman legitimacy and prestige. From then on, rulers derive their legitimacy from their relationship to Caesar, often explicitly, right, by bearing their name, calling themselves Caesars. That's why there's so many Caesars in the history of leaders. The victim turned god, captured through myth for Girard, is what lies at the heart of pagan religion and society. But of course, we need much more than stories to run a society and keep the peace. So out of these myths and founding murders, two sets of real institutions were derived: prohibitions and rituals. The logic of prohibitions is to prevent chaos from erupting by creating social difference between people so that metaphysical desire does not spread as easily. Caste systems, gender roles, guild lineages, however oppressive, these served a crucial function in pagan society to keep people from competing with each other.
Rishi, the difference between Abrahamic societies and non-Abrahamic societies is that Abrahamic societies started, at least Christianity and Islam, from the perspective of the victim themselves or the scapegoat themselves, whereas the other societies celebrated a scapegoat. So, no, I'm not going to talk about that religion, but Jesus Christ, at least, was the scapegoat.
Each other. Now, when prohibitions failed, another set of institutions must be used, and these are rituals. Rituals aim to enact the founding murder in a constrained way to generate a similar level of catharsis as the founding murder did. Ritual incest, debaucherous festivals, human sacrifice, however cruel, these institutions also served a crucial function in pagan society to generate catharsis in order to keep the peace. They are a release valve. To summarize then, the scapegoat mechanism proceeds.
Yeah, if it's a release valve, the scapegoat, then kafirs possibly. Yeah, Rishi might be right.
From a real cataclysmic event where a troubled society murders an innocent victim, gains cathartic release, and receives a set of new gods. This real event is dramatized and captured in myth, and then translated back into real institutions in the form of prohibitions and rituals. This arc, going from real event to myth to real institutions, is not only how pagan gods and religions have been made, but also how all human societies and cultures are founded. Now, of course, these societies and myths are based on lies through and through. Both the scapegoating and the deification are equally deceitful because the victim neither has the power to cause or end the chaos. It's all psychological projection by the crowd, grounded on nothing but unanimity. And importantly, this deceitfulness is always occluded by myth because myth is written.
But notice, Rishi, that the dead kafir is not becoming a god, right? So also remember, then even Islam is probably not created from the perspective of the scapegoat in the society. Although people do argue that Prophet Muhammad had a pretty tough life growing up in that horrible desert society. But since kafir is not becoming the god, therefore in Islam we could argue it's just that the post ad hoc rationalizations don't exist, but the need to commit violence that exists regardless. So the scapegoat for it, the need for scapegoating in the broader sense, that is there in Islamic society as well.
From the perspective, neither has the power to cause or end the chaos. It's all psychological projection by the crowd, grounded on nothing but unanimity. And importantly, this deceitfulness is always occluded by myth, because myth is written from the perspective of the persecutor.
Well, Rishi, up until a point, their scapegoats were basically Brahmins. But then when they stopped doing any scapegoating, they became irrelevant.
Persecutor writes from a position of the crowd. And from that vantage point, all will seem real. The blame, the praise, the deification are all deserved and not mere projections. But more importantly, none of this could be revealed. Because if they were, then gods would lose their powers if people realized that it was they themselves who, through unanimity, projected the power onto them.
By the way, remember, Buddha was the king of asceticism. He's almost starved himself to death, and therefore one could argue he almost gave himself up as a scapegoat of society, almost sacrificed himself in search of truth, and therefore became deified.
All deceitful and all arbitrary. This explanation of pagan religion by Girard then begs an important question. Why is Girard a Christian? Prima facie, Christianity perfectly conforms to this logic that he attributed to false pagan religions, right? There's civil unrest in Jerusalem, where Christ eventually gets crucified. There's obviously Christ's unjust scapegoating and murder on the cross. There's the resurrection and divinization. There's the mythologization through the Bible. And then there's the institutionalization through the Catholic Church and many of its prohibitions and rituals. The question is this: how can the Christian story be true for Girard, but the pagan religions be false? Girard's answer is that the Christian story is indeed going to have the same structure as pagan religion, because Christ is going to be scapegoated. But there's one crucial difference. Christianity will be the first story told from the perspective of the victim. Remember, pagan myth always sides with the murderers. It always believes in the guilt of its victims. Sophocles' telling of Oedipus affirms the judgment of Thebes, that Oedipus was indeed responsible for the plague because of his patricide and incest. Or take the founding murder of the Roman Republic, that of Romulus and Remus, where Romulus kills Remus to establish Rome. The canonical telling here, again, paints the killing as, however regrettable, as justified by Remus's hubris and transgression from ignoring Romulus's city's boundaries. What the Bible is doing then is to tell the same type of story as pagan religion, but from the other perspective. Not the perspective of the persecutor, which all pagan religion has been told from, but the victim. I mean, think about it. What does the Bible tell us? He tells us that Christ is not guilty. Even his sentencer, Pontius Pilate, declares his innocence. The mob that convicts Christ is shown to be arbitrary, the true source of evil. The sentencing of Christ is depicted as unjust through and through, with the charges against Christ nothing more than psychological projections by the crowd. This is what that story tells us. And of course, the whole story is written down and told to us by the disciples, the side of the victim and not the persecutor. Christianity tells the story of scapegoating, but from the opposite, truthful side. We are like jurors who have been hearing the criminal's lies for so long in pagan religion, suddenly exposed to the truth of the victim's testimony.
And therefore, egalitarianism and the obsession with equality, and therefore victimhood, and therefore conflating empathy with sympathy also has roots in Christianity.
The crucifixion exposes the lies of all religions to show that the mob is deceitful, the victim is innocent. There's no sacred pagan power that is merely projection. This is the fundamental, resounding message that comes out of the crucifixion for Girard. And it is a message that will expose and begin to tear down the scapegoat mechanism, slowly but surely. From this moment on, we will be reading myths in the light of the Gospels, which allows us to see through their lies. Christ's innocence.
And hence, a society that celebrates winners and not victims happened in USA because they came up with their own Bible. And of course, first Protestantism happened, then Thomas Jefferson wrote his own Bible and stuff.
And unjust persecution through the proliferation of Christianity becomes the dominant lens through which we will view the world from then on. We will always be looking out for unjust persecution. We will always be siding with the victim. We will always be aware of the deceitfulness of the mob. Christ knows that reason alone, that an analytical articulation of the scapegoat mechanism, like the one I just provided you, is not enough to shake societies out of this perennial cultural practice. What we need is an equally compelling story that shakes us into a radically new mode of seeing the world.
To your point, I'm always surprised by how much of our secular world is grounded on Christian concepts. I think of the Protestant work ethic, our concern for victims, human rights,
Yeah, and this is how powerful the Christian story is. We are all, in a sense, living in a Christian paradigm, even if we're not explicitly Christians, because Christianity grounds the fundamental philosophical intuitions of modernity. Christianity, then, for Girard, is the religion to end all religions, the myth to end all myths, the founding murder to end all founding murders, by exposing their violent, unjust, and deceitful origins. The right metaphor to think about Christianity and pagan religion, then, is the relationship between a vaccine and the original disease. The efficacy of a vaccine to neutralize the original disease lies in its proximity, not its radical difference, right? Structurally, the COVID vaccine is very similar to the original COVID disease, just with a few tweaks. And it's that similarity is what makes it an effective COVID vaccine and not like a polio vaccine, for example. The Bible, then, for Girard, is a myth vaccine. And so the strategy of many modern Christians to show that the Bible has nothing to do with the myths of yore, that it is radically different, is misguided. I mean, take the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the first known myths of Mesopotamia. Modern Christians blush at the similarities between this myth and the Bible, right? There's a quest for a fruit of immortality from the tree of eternal life. These are things that both exist in the Bible as well as the myth of Gilgamesh. There's a deceitful snake eating a fruit and robbing us of our immortality. And there's also great floods from which the chosen are protected. Girard would say, look, don't blush and don't try to distance the Bible from these myths. The Bible is effective because and not despite of its proximity to myths. The Bible is a Trojan horse that frees us from pagan religion from within. Girard's surprising conclusion is that Christianity is a demystifying force here to end all religions. The Christian moral paradigm takes away the core.
And René Girard did not live long enough to find out that it demystified so hard that it popularized the concept of victimhood and human and distorted the idea of human rights in the first place, or not in the first place, at least after René Girard was dead. That became the sole single agenda of things that came out of Christianity.
Or foundational bedrock of all early human societies. Slowly but surely, Christianity allows us to decode and escape from the scapegoat mechanism, which cannot function if people know that the victim is innocent. If the victim is shown to be innocent, then catharsis cannot be achieved. Without catharsis, there's no peace. Without peace, there's no deification. Without deification, pagan worldly institutions lose their prestige, and without prestige, they can no longer properly function.
And hence, I allege that the goat might not be the right thing to make a scapegoat out of.
Christianity takes humanity out of cyclical time, demarcated by these relativistic moral paradigm shifts, and accelerates us towards a linear trajectory. Now, the direction of this linearity is defined by 4 key forces that Christ lets loose on human history: love, truth, innovation, and surprisingly, Girard thinks, violence. As with all things Girard, even his analysis on the worldly effects of Christianity are deeply ambivalent. Within this Pandora's box of forces that Christ has just let loose on human history, we have the good, love, truth, innovation, but also the apocalyptic, violence. They are both growing and have broken free all at the same time. What's more, even within these individual forces, Girard's analysis is deeply ambivalent. Love often manifests as hypocrisy. Truth becomes dogma, and innovation degenerates into fashion.
You see, that's why that's why it led to wokeness.
And even in violence, Girard sees a key motivational force that has brought forth the most enviable living conditions of man when channeled productively through capitalism. Let's examine each of these forces in turn. The first force that Christianity unleashes on history is love. Love is the force that has made all of our institutions like law so much more humane. It's the force that sees developed nations competing for the prestige of helping troubled nations. It's the force that has freed us from cruel practices of human sacrifice and bloody rituals. It's the force underpinning the modern political ideals of human rights and equality.
No, Rishi, it has to be in the context of the entire society, not just one particular text.
Girard believes that Christ is responsible for all of this because that was his key message. Renounce violence, turn the other cheek, develop love, love thy neighbor as thyself. We are so concerned with the poor and the dispossessed these days, we naturally side with victims in the same way that pagan societies might have sided with the strong. Because Christ's story is about the innocence and the moral purity of victims. Culturally, we are radically different from pagan society, with their worship of power and disregard for the weak. But in some sense, stubborn human
Worship of power. That's where we are different from postmodernists.
nature still refuses to budge. Culturally, we are radically different from pagan society, with their worship of power and disregard for the weak. But in some sense, stubborn human nature still refuses to budge. Girard thinks we still need to persecute, but the only acceptable way to persecute is now in the name of victims, in the name of stopping persecution. In a way, then, Girard isn't convinced society has really changed that much at all, that we've really given up persecution. Rather, perhaps the better reading is that it's a mere superficial switch of who we think it's acceptable to persecute.
Yes.
Because of our victim-concerned culture, anyone who looks like a traditional victim is completely off limits. Ethnic minorities, the lower classes, women, the disabled, and Girard thinks that's a great thing. But the problem is that we've flipped it on its head.
Right.
Now we feel warranted, nay, maybe even compelled to persecute all types of privilege. White privilege, ableist privilege, class privilege, male privilege. Girard has this to say. I'll give you a quote. Our society's obligatory compassion authorizes new forms of cruelty.
Whoa. So you see, in fact, René Girard, even though he did not live to see wokeism at its peak, but he predicted even that. So I guess you would say that you can't blame Christianity for this.
Girard accuses modernity of hypocrisy, and he reminds us of terrible atrocities committed in the name of protecting victims. Let me give you another quote.
Atrocities committed in the name of protecting victims, in the name of doing things.
Hypocrisy is dangerous then because it leads to what it claims to prevent, the persecution of victims. Anyone familiar with the tragedies of the Soviet Union grounded on protection of the victimized proletariat should look at America's caught up in victimhood ideology with trembling fear. This other totalitarianism, this inquisition in the name of victims is the form that arbitrary, unjustified violence takes place today, the persecution of persecutors. And
hypocrisy is dangerous then because it leads to what it claims to prevent, which is persecution of victims. Anyone familiar with the tragedies of the Soviet Union grounded on protection of the वो पिछले लाइव स्ट्रीम में एथिज्म को जस्टिफाई कर रहा था वो कहाँ गया familiar with anyone familiar with the tragedies of the Soviet Union grounded on protection of the victimized proletariat should look at America's caught up in victimhood ideology with trembling fear. This quote-unquote other totalitarianism, this inquisition in the name of victims, is the form of that arbitrary, unjustified violence that takes place today, which is the persecution of persecutors or alleged persecutors.
End quote. Now, that's love. And the same ambivalent story could be told for the second force of Christianity, truth. Girard asks us to look around in the modern world. More so than any almost other civilization, we value truth and believe in our ability to obtain it. Far are we from the Garden of Eden's prohibitions against the tree of knowledge. Far are we from the intellectual humilities of Job. Far are we from the lessons from Oedipus that knowing more can lead to disaster. And far are we from witch hunts and superstitions. Perhaps unsurprisingly at this point, Girard takes the crowning achievement of truth, science, to be engendered by Christianity. This might seem ridiculous, but let me give you a first pass at his argument. Christianity paved the way for scientific inquiry by expelling myth and clearing the ground, as it were.
Only thanks to Thomas Aquinas.
This should already be a familiar idea at this point. Christianity exposes the deceitfulness of worldly foundations and begins to tear down prohibitions, rituals, and all pagan religions. And it is only when we cease to look for truth in myth does reason even have the fertile ground to bear the fruits of truth. After all, if something is already explained by a wildly prestigious myth that is fatal to question, then reason will not even want to begin to investigate it. Girard's interlocutor sums up his view quite nicely here. Let me quote again. It is really Christianity that makes science possible by desacralizing the real, by freeing people from magical causalities. Once we stop seeing storms as being triggered by the machinations of the witch across the street, we start being able to study meteorological phenomenon scientifically, end quote. Now, I need to say a lot more, and I will, to convince you of this point.
But you see, that happened in Indian society at some point as well, which is why we did a bit of mathematics and a bit of physics and geology and astronomy and stuff. But not everyone followed. So that's why Hindu society took a different turn, as did Christian society. So no matter how good the idea, people are going to fuck it up.
End quote. Now, I need to say a lot more, and I will, to convince you of this point. But before we celebrate too early, the same problem with love occurs with truth. Just as the protection of victims is the banner which persecutors rally under, we love science so much that we have fetishized it into an unquestionable religion. But what's the problem with science gaining an immense prestige? What's wrong with that? Girard's answer is this. By being deified, science can become unquestionable, which can silence opposing voices and justify terrible political agendas. Think about Malthus in the 18th century. He reasoned that living standards would go back to subsistence because population growth grows geometrically while food increases arithmetically. Now, in the 1970s, there was a whole wave of ridiculous climate science championed by the Times, the New York Review, Columbia, Brown. They were publishing articles about an inevitable ice age that just seems ludicrous from today's perspective. And of course, the terrors of the Nazis were justified on the latest science of the day, eugenics. Far from a pseudoscience, eugenics enjoyed enormous prestige in the early 20th century. It was grounded on Darwin, the latest evolutionary biology of the day, and responsible for the development of statistics. There was a University College London chair of eugenics, in the same way there might be a chair for biology today. And eugenics was supported by Nobel laureates like Hermann Muller and political leaders like Theodore Roosevelt. So I hope the problem of deifying science is clear. Girard thinks the reason that it is dangerous to deify science is the same reason it was dangerous to deify edicts of the Catholic Church. Just as the bloody European conquest of the Americas was, at least partially, legitimized through the appeal to Catholicism as spreading the gospel, today we too legitimize our often questionable political pursuits with just a sprinkle of reason and a little dab of science. And just as whomever...
Well, Rishi, it's not entirely correct to say that Christianity as a whole paved way for science, but a certain way of Christianity in a certain time and in a certain Christian society, that paved way for science. But these things happen repeatedly, as did in ancient India.
used to disagree
And even Ramanujan.
with the Catholic Church, we called heretics. We call those today who disagree with politically charged, questionable science as anti-science, someone whose positions we don't even have to contend with. When deified, science becomes a blocker to truth and genuine inquiry, because it becomes a conversation stopper. Therein lies the hypocrisy. Now, the third force of Christianity is innovation, and it has been engendered by Christ in a very similar way that science was. By tearing down myths, we are freed from an exaggerated idolation of the past, and we are enabled, empowered to imagine its future. The idea that Girard has in mind here might be better approximated by thinking about the negative case. What is certainly not conducive to innovation is the reactionary idea, not uncommon throughout most of history. Most famously, perhaps, among the Confucians and perhaps many Christians, that our best days are behind us, right? And such a view lends to the practical orientation that the best we can do is to blindly imitate the past and press the brakes on the downward trajectory of history. Under such a worldview, the very word innovation had negative connotations in the West up until the 18th century. Its connotations were negative because innovation implied a deviation from a sacred, albeit static and rigid ideal provided to us by the myths of yore. Innovation before the 18th century was synonymous with heresy. Now, such an exaggerated respect of the past is often grounded on a religious belief in a mythologized past. Christianity frees us from this blind worship because it is a force, according to Girard, of course, that tears down mythologization. It reveals to us what we once thought of as immutable, as arbitrary, so we are free to experiment and innovate.
One of the surprising things that I've seen is this weird anti-correlation between mythologizing the past and innovation. And I started to get this hunch when I would spend time around Silicon Valley types, and you have dinner with them and they boast about their knowledge of the world. But then you start talking to them about the history of their own industry, and it's not something that they think or talk about a lot. And I compare that to the people I've met in the oil industry or the finance industry, these older and more established industries, where the people who I meet there, they know the history.
So you see, innovation inherently was heretical at one point. It became heretical again in Christendom, but Christianity itself was supposed to be an innovation and breaking away from orthodoxies and conservatism. But it's also important to remember that Christianity itself is not just directly from Jesus Christ. Christianity, as we know it, is basically just what Paul the Apostle wrote. The Gospel of Paul is basically Christianity.
Of their industry's cold. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting observation that there is a negative correlation between how innovative an industry or a person is against how much they know about history, or at least seem to respect it.
Yes.
And I think Girard would say that the difference between the tech industry and the oil industry is the same difference between modernity and pagan society, that we are much less idolatrous and concerned with the past, and as a result, much more oriented towards the future due to Christianity. Now, as we are freed from the grips of the past, innovation has brought about drastic technological and social change. Clearly, if you just look around our world, right, there's the mastery of travel and land, air, and sea. There's the victory over disease and starvation, the political systems, gender norms, money. Western civilization, at least in the past few hundred years, is defined by and prides itself with change. Now, the problem with innovation is the same problem with love and truth, hypocrisy. We've now fetishized innovation. We are conforming to contrarianism. We are obediently rallying under the banner of originality.
Oh, bhai, see, put this in context to the idea of quote unquote breaking stereotypes in Indian commie society. We are obediently rallying under the banner of originality. We are in India, the commies are obediently rallying behind the idea of breaking gender stereotypes or religious stereotypes.
Girard has this to say. It's so good that I'll quote it in full. The modern world rejects imitation in favor of originality at all costs. You should never say what others are saying, never paint what others are painting, never think what others are thinking, and so on. Since this is absolutely impossible, there soon emerges a negative imitation that sterilizes. More and more, often they're obliged to turn their coats inside out and with great fanfare announce some new epistemological rupture that is supposed to revolutionize the field from top to bottom. This rage for originality has produced a few rare masterpieces and quite a few rather bizarre things.
Rather
The
bizarre things.
principle of
Rather bizarre things. We know what rather bizarre things that thankfully René Girard did not have to live to see.
originality at all costs leads to paralysis. The more we celebrate creative and enriching innovations, the fewer of them there are. For 2,000 years, the arts have been imitative, and it's only in the 19th and 20th century that people started refusing to be mimetic. Why? Because we're more mimetic than ever. Rivalry plays a role such that we strive vainly to exercise imitation.
So you see, when in the 19th and 20th centuries, some fun new genres in art of all kind, whether it's music and stuff, starts happening. Within a matter of 100, 200 years, it all starts going downhill again.
End quote. The problem that Girard is identifying here with categorically rejecting imitation and idolizing innovation is that imitation and meaningful innovation are often inseparable. You need to imitate and gain mastery first before you can make any real innovations. History is littered with examples where repetition, replication, imitation is a necessary precondition for innovation. Think about Goethe, who was a master of reproduction, reproducing the great poetic forms before he pioneered his own. Think about the industrial powers that started off as mere copycats, but grew into innovators in their own right. Let me read Girard again.
Right. Remember, what are these quote unquote breaking gender stereotypes or breaking social norms, cultural norms, or quote unquote breaking religious stereotypes, etc.? What are they really achieving? What are they really coming up with? What are they innovating? Nothing, right? So, if on the very first day of your, let's say, guitar class or classical music class, you don't learn saregama, you don't learn an ancient raga, or you don't learn a song that has already been composed, if you don't imitate to begin with, what in the fuck are you going to learn, and then consequently what the fuck are you going to compose on your own?
It began with Germany, which in the 19th century was thought to be at most capable of imitating English. And this at the precise moment it surpassed them. It continued with the Americans, in whom, for a long time, the European...
No, constant innovation is a pointless endeavor. Constant innovation leads to paralysis, because with constant innovation, you don't create anything that's of any value to anyone.
saw mediocre gadget makers who weren't theoretical or cerebral enough to take on a world.
Just like, remember, why is casteism or structures like caste inevitable? Because with disruption, the last 50 or 100 years of casteism will go away. But if it doesn't get disruption soon enough, there will again be casteism. But if all there is disruption, then forget caste, no society can exist even. Because every day you are reinventing yourself, every day you are looking for a new job, every day you are upskilling. कोई एक स्किल सीख के उसमें कुछ तो एक स्टेबिलिटी लाना होगा, मगर स्टेबिलिटी जब बहुत दिन से रहने लगेगा तभी वहां पे वो स्टेटस बेस्ड बैड बिहेवियर आ जाएगा.
World leadership role. And it happened once more with the Japanese, who after World War II were still seen as pathetic imitators of Western superiority. It's starting up again, it seems, with Korea. And soon, perhaps, it'll be the Chinese. All of these consecutive mistakes about the creative potential of imitation cannot be due to chance. End quote. Girard's point here is that by fetishizing contrarianism, innovation, originality, and by rejecting repetition, replication, imitation, we paradoxically doom ourselves to never make any meaningful innovations whatsoever, because innovation is dependent on imitation. Now, as you can see, even the three quote-unquote good forces...
Our commie homies obviously didn't get the memo. Imitation is necessary for innovation.
...of modernity are deeply ambivalent. Culture has fundamentally changed. There's never been a society as loving, truthful, and innovative as ours. But stubborn human nature refuses to budge. We still need to persecute, to deify, and to conform. And so the perversities of modernity for Girard all take on the shape of hypocrisy.
Yeah, so see, where Western society might have created the most tolerant, most prosperous society, But regardless, they still fucked up Middle East.
Execution under the banner of protecting victims, rigid adherence to scientific dogmas under the guise of free intellectual exploration, the most derivative of imitations, packaged as radical innovations. The metaphor, then, that best captures this radical break as well as stubborn continuity is a just launched rocket struggling to reach escape velocity. I mean, think about it. Such a rocket is clearly a radical break from it was stationary, but it is also in a continuity because it is still governed by the pull of gravity. The same, perhaps, can be said for the point of history that we're in now. There's a clear radical break between our culture that protects victims and all the ones that have come before, which made them into scapegoats. But the stubborn gravitational pull of the human condition remains the same. We still need to persecute and find victims to blame. It's this tension between cultural advancement and the constancy of human nature that plagues modernity for Girard.
Oh,
Now, our rocket ship of modernity is already in trouble, but the fourth and final force of Christianity will send it crashing towards the ground: violence. You may be surprised that Girard conceived of violence as one of the forces coming out of Christ defeating the scapegoat mechanism. But given Girard's understanding of how worldly peace is brought about, this conclusion, in some sense, should flow quite naturally. After all, if worldly order, a peaceful society, is founded on a deceitful, violent act of catharsis, then truth and love, which Christianity has unleashed, must be threatening, if not harmful, for this foundation. Right? The scapegoat mechanism is a deeply morally ambivalent process for Girard. It is deceitful, it is wrong, but it's also so damn effective. Just a single innocent man has to be murdered for the entire community to be saved. Sacrifice one for the peace of all. Limit the freedom of the parts for the stability of the whole. And so, we might say, in a highly reductive fashion, that the scapegoat mechanism is a worldly good, but ultimate evil, whereas Christ is ultimately good, but brings forth worldly destruction. Girard constantly reminds us that Christ himself says as much. Matthew 10:34, Christ's mechanism. And so, we might say, in a highly reductive fashion,
check this line out, guys.
that the scapegoat mechanism is a worldly good, but ultimate evil, whereas Christ is ultimately good, but brings forth worldly destruction.
Oh,
Girard constantly reminds us that Christ himself says as much. Matthew 10:34, Christ has this to say: "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword." Christ's sword is aimed at the scapegoat mechanism, which lies at the foundation of worldly order. Now, while the consequences of the Christian revelation for Girard are violent and destructive, Christ's intentions surely are not. Christ did not cut down the worldly order for the sake of cutting down worldly order, but only so we may be freed from violence and lies, such that we can love each other. Christ took off our training wheels so that we may be freed, yet we've simply fallen and stumbled. Without the scapegoat mechanism, we no longer have our old prohibitions to stop metaphysical desires from running rampant, nor do we have sacrificial rituals to bring about catharsis. So, to put in other words, we've lost both our tools to prevent and resolve violence. So why haven't we gotten bust yet? After all, the world looks pretty peaceful to me. Girard responds, don't confuse the lack of the actuality of violence with the lack of the potential for violence. Violent energies have been building up and increasing, but they've been contained and productively channeled, for now, by two new institutions of modernity. The first institution is capitalism. Capitalism is the channel that absorbs and productively directs violence. Now, let me be clear that when Girard says that capitalism is a channel for violence, he doesn't have in mind, whipping slaves to build the pyramids, but that the same violent competitive energies of glory, of pride, of desire for conquest are the dominant ones driving capitalism today. Girard reminds us, I quote, "It is not by chance that the European aristocracy went into business once heroes and warriors went out of style," end quote.
so in a way, capitalism takes the world away from the world where the victim is the the victim's perspective is everything. The scapegoat's perspective is everything, and takes us into a world where again the heroes are celebrated, the victims are the scapegoats. So the poorer ones, against which commies rally, because commies are better Christians than Christian capitalists themselves, and hence the success of USA, not because of Christianity, in spite of it.
Girard's point is that when we peek behind the barriers, when evidence that the European era, Girard reminds us, I quote, "It is not by chance that the European aristocracy went into business once heroes and warriors went out of style," end quote. Girard's point is that when we peek behind the motivational curtains of actors in capitalism, we shouldn't expect to find a desire to help others.
Yeah.
We shouldn't even expect to find materialistic greed. Instead, what people are really after are the same social goods:
Yes.
recognition, honor, prestige,
Yes.
glory.
Yes.
The princes and heroes of yore who would have amassed armies now find themselves competing to make products and services.
Yes.
Girard warns us such. Don't be fooled by the altruistic aims that capitalistic actors so desperately advertise. It's the same drive that drove Achilles to kill Hector, that drove Germany
Yes. It's the same signal theory still going on. Either they are going to negate it or going to copy it.
to invade France, that drove Caesar to capture Vercingetorix, that underpins our world economy today.
It's funny, you're referencing ancient stories there, but even today, I'll look at my friends who are successful entrepreneurs, and a shocking percentage of them were criminals in high school.
Right.
And I think that the same energy that drove them to be criminals, what capitalism does is it redirects that energy towards entrepreneurship.
Yeah. And I think this is both.
That is why nice guys never succeed in capitalism. Nice guys meaning harmless nice guys. And therefore, when Bengali society portrayed their biggest heroes as simply just nothing guys and nice guys and nothing else, that created fertile ground for communism, which ultimately destroyed Bengali society completely. So I think it's important to remember, therefore, that the destruction of Bengali society didn't start with Jyoti Basu. Jyoti Basu was a symptom. The acceptance of capitalism, communism, and Jyoti Basu, that society, the stupidity of that society started with misappropriating Chaitanya Mahaprabhu.
Deep critique of capital, right? That it's fundamentally driven off these spirited, irrational forces, but also a deep praise of capitalism, right? What a miracle it is today that people who seek revenge, who seek glory, who seek domination, who seek an outlet for their criminal energies have to do so. Not by killing millions in zero-sum wars, as people have done for thousands of years.
Yeah.
But they have to compete in making better products and services for others. What a miracle. Girard's analysis on capitalism is deeply ambivalent. Now, capitalism can only properly function in this way when it is supported by law. Law is the second important institution of modernity that contains violence. For Girard, law only works in situations where there's an entity with a monopoly over violence that can arbitrate between disputing parties. Law does not bring about peace through catharsis, nor are the edicts of law justified on the prestige of some deity. It keeps peace by threatening you with more violence. If you, the injured party, aren't satisfied with the outcome of a trial and seek private vengeance by killing or hurting the criminal who injured you, then the state, right, will come after you and punish you with more violence. Law only functions when there is such a powerful entity with a monopoly over violence that can easily overpower disputing parties. That's where its efficacy stems from. This is why, within a single nation, laws are often inviolable and sacrosanct. Yet between nations, right? Think the laws of the UN or the Geneva Convention. Mm-hmm. These laws, without an entity, without a monopoly over violence, are so often transgressed with little consequence.
Rishi, yes, that's because our country almost entirely runs on Christian morality, egalitarian morality, and most people would absolutely hate Nietzsche, both Hindus and Christians, because Hindus have also been infected by Christian morality. the Hindutva socialists?
For Girard, capitalism is this bubbling stew of violent competitive energies that must be contained by law if that violence is not to overflow. That is why Girard thinks the dike will break where capitalism intersects the weakest points of law in between nations in global trade. Global trade is where national pride and competitive energies are piled up, yet there is no monopolistic force of violence to arbitrate law between parties. Under this light, let me read you Girard's startling predictions 15 years ago once more. He said this again at the height of Sino-American optimism, when popular wisdom all believed that relationships between China and the US would only get better through trade. I quote to you again, "A conflict between the United States and China will follow. Everything is in place, though it will not necessarily occur on the military level at first. Trade can transform very quickly into war. From this point of view, we can reasonably fear a major clash between China and the United States in the coming decades." Now, if such a war between colossal nation states were to actually happen, it could very well be the last war. With the invention of nuclear weaponry, Girard thinks we genuinely do live in an apocalyptic moment where the entire world can go up in flames in mere minutes. What is unique about the nuke isn't its singular destructive force, right? The firebombing of Tokyo, the Mongol mass murders, I think are all comparable to the devastation of a singular nuclear strike. What is unique about the nuke is that it forces rivals to utterly destroy each other at the first glimpse of provocation. Unlike firebombing or a Mongol horde that takes time to maneuver through terrain, there are no frictions to unleashing your entire nuclear arsenal. Before the nuke, nations fought wars like a boxing match, taking time to maneuver, resting in between, with fatal blows rare and often taking a very long time. The nuke allows nation states to fight wars like a duel, an instant and fatal escalation. In many ways, it's worse than a duel because it allows the dead party to shoot the person who is alive. Even if you nuke my entire landmass into oblivion, my nuclear submarines can still avenge me post-mortem. This is what it means by mutually assured destruction. Framed in this light, Girard's worries of apocalypse is less theological speculation than déjà vu. On October 27, 1962, a Soviet submarine armed with a nuclear-tipped torpedo was located and targeted by an American carrier group, dropping signaling depth charges, essentially like underwater bombs intended to destroy the submarine. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the crew in that submarine had completely lost contact with Moscow for days and thought that a new world war had broken out. They were debating and considering whether to fire the nuke, believing that they were under direct attack. Now, this submarine required all 3 senior officers to agree to launch the strike. 2 of them decided to do so. Only one officer's stubborn refusal prevented an almost certain nuclear attack and likely Armageddon. This is how close we were. The will of one man was all that stood in the way. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the specter of apocalypse has long faded from the public imagination. But Girard prophesizes that this ghost of yore will soon return to haunt us once more. If the end of the world had a beginning, I think we could do far worse than attributing it to the invention of the nuclear bomb. So how ought one live in the end times? With apocalypse around the corner, what ought one do? Girard's answer is brief as it is unsatisfying. Withdraw. Withdraw from the world. Leave it all behind. Tend to your own garden. There's nothing.
Vairagya and renunciation in the end. Holy shit. Showman Balti, by the way, I implore you, definitely check out this live stream from the very beginning. You'll love it.
You can do to stop apocalypse. You're only going to muddy your own moral character by trying to get involved in such a mess. Withdraw. Stay away from it all so that you can nurture your soul. The kingdom of God will not be established here on earth, but perhaps we can preserve ourselves to be worthy of it in heaven. On November 4th, 2015, Girard passed away peacefully in his home in Stanford, California at the age of 91, leaving us in deafening silence.
Oh, he passed away in 2015. इसीलिए इतना सब देखा वोकिज्म पे. अच्छा.
Stranded in an apocalyptic moment with nothing but the advice to withdraw. This is how Girard's story ends, and where our lectures will also come to a screeching halt. Hopefully, I've given enough reason already to engage with Girard and continue with these lecture series. I fear that as time progresses, Girard will prove to be, if you'll entertain another metaphor, a seismograph of history, able to feel the slight tremors that would balloon to tectonic shifts before others even know that we are standing on a fault line. Girard begins his final work as such. This is an apocalyptic book. It will become more understandable with time because, unquestionably, we are accelerating swiftly towards the destruction of the world, end quote. Unfortunately, his most unlikely prediction of worsening Sino-American relationships has already been made more understandable with time. On the topic of apocalypse, I desperately hope Girard is wrong, but I fear that he is right. If he is right, then Girard is worth engaging because he is one of the only guides to help us navigate the end time, one of the few Virgils left who still take apocalypse literally and seriously. However, I would be a deceitful merchant of ideas if I also didn't share with you why you shouldn't engage with Girard or continue with these lectures. There's a common metaphor given about philosophy. Philosophy is often compared with medicine, that it has the power to cure our souls and societies, and I think that's a quite apt metaphor, but just not taken far enough. Because just as medicine has side effects, so do philosophies. And I wish that philosophers wrote on the side of their books the unwanted side effects of their philosophies as pharmaceutical companies did on their drugs. Warning, disdain for the material world if you take too much of these Platonic dialogues in one sitting. Caution, more than one dose of Nietzsche a day makes patients with pre-existing health conditions descend into uncontrollable rage. Side effect, erectile dysfunction if you take these Buddhist sutras too seriously. Attention, inability to form coherent sentences if you read too much Adorno in one sitting. Just as a drug will course through your veins and infiltrate your entire system, Girard's ideas will latch themselves onto your psyche and colonize your worldview.
Yes.
So we must ask, what are the side effects of engaging Girard? I've presented to you the red pill, but as any honest merchant, I must also tell you why you should take the blue pill instead. The likely but not necessary side effects of Girard are threefold. First, alienation. Girard will likely show your most intimate, long-held desires, ones that your entire identity have been staked on, as external and alien. The career you've always wanted since you were 4, the type of person you wanted to marry since childhood, the political cause that you've dedicated your life to, your core desires will likely be thoroughly alienated and shown to be external and perhaps even perverse. Mimetic theory could also alienate you from others. From this point going forward, you'll have trouble fully participating in any political or collective activity, always aware of the deceitfulness of mimesis and the madness of crowds. Second, inaction. Girard is the most ambivalent writer that I've ever come across. What should we do with the scapegoating? Well, on one hand, it's a huge lie. You're killing innocents. But on the other, it is the only way that pagan societies have brought peace. Should we fight to remove caste systems? Well, if you don't, then you will subject people to arbitrary distinction, meaningless oppression, grounded on nothing but lies. But if you do, you open them up to competition of all against all. Metaphysical desire will burn through their communities and set it ablaze. Should we participate in capitalism? Capitalism is a competitive cesspool of violent energies that has brought about the most lovely, prosperous, and peaceful society known to date. If you are looking for clear-cut answers, or even answers at all, you've come knocking on the wrong door. Go to a Marx or Hegel instead. The extreme ambivalence in all of Girard's ideas, in addition to his deep pessimism on the human condition and history, tends to incapacitate those who've digested them a bit too thoroughly. Third, and certainly not least, the side effect of Girard is hopelessness. By now,
Yeah.
the point should be familiar. Apocalypse is imminent. There is nothing you nor I nor anyone can do about it. If you do wish to remain hopeful after understanding and digesting Girard, just know that that hope is going to have to come from you and not Girard.
Oh.
You are going to have to dig yourself and all of us out of this apocalyptic hole.
Yeah.
Girard really has nothing left to offer. Turn back while you still can. I have warned you thus. Now, to those stubborn or perhaps morbidly curious enough to continue, I can only heed one last time against continuing on these lectures by echoing what Dante inscribed on the gates of hell. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here.
So what the fuck? It all boils down to vairagya and renunciation, asceticism, bosrike. But of course, without getting rid of the signal that comes out of it. But you see, why does Hinduism seem to have answers on all these questions? Because Hindu society is a very long ass society. It's a very advanced civilization of whom we are seeing the, let's say, the we are seeing the remnants of ancient Hinduism till date, and that's the only reason we are still here. But इतना अगर एडवांस्ड बहुत दिनों से चलने वाला अगर सिविलाइजेशन होगा तो वहां पे कैस्टिज्म होगा ही, वहां पे ऐसे सारे के सारे आंसर्स भी मिलेंगे. किसी ना किसी ने कहीं ना कहीं कुछ ना कुछ सोच के रख के लिख लिया है. बहुत सारे टेक्स्ट गड्ढे में चले गए, बहुत सारे लिखा ही नहीं, बहुत सारे भूल गए. तो इसीलिए भाई कुछ ना कुछ टेक्स्ट उठा के उससे तुम्हारा खुद का आज का आइडियाज जस्टिफाई करना बंद करो और हर कुछ में संस्कृत वर्ड घुसा के वर्चुअल सिग्नलिंग बंद करो. तो यस, Showman Balti, yes, in a way, but make sure to watch this from the very beginning as well. And now we will go offline. Thanks a lot for taking part in this very, very fun and juicy conversation, guys. Thank you. Good night.
যদি সবাই ফিরে যায়, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা সবাই ফিরে যায়, যদি গহন পথে যাওয়ার কালে কেউ ফিরে না যায়, তবে পথের কাটা তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না তবে একলা চলো রে. যদি আলো না ধরে, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা আলো না ধরে, যদি ঝড় বাদলে আধার রাতে দুয়ার দেয় ঘরে, তবে বজ্রানলে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে, তবে একলা চলো রে. একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো.